All right, I would like to thank all of you for coming this afternoon here in Boulder. It is June 23rd, 2018, just for the record. And we're going to take a quick trip through the cosmology and then a deep dive into what our folks at the CIA call WSFM. Not a radio station, it stands for Weird Science and Frickin' Magic. All the classified technologies, where they're located, when they were developed, how they've been deployed, et cetera, and so on. So I'd like to thank first some folks who've made this possible. University of Colorado School here, Wolf Law School, which has provided the facility. Neil for his webinar help. Lyra and Ricky and Marcel and Grant and all the folks out front who are our volunteers. Thank you all for making this happen. And a big thank you all for coming here in person, spend your Saturday afternoon with us. I would like to start by saying that, give you a little bit of context of why I'm doing these last few webinars and seminars. There's a need at this point for me to do a brain dump, for lack of a better word, out into the public domain ahead of some things that the public needs to know. Some of these are subjects that I've talked about peripherally, but I think it needs to go into in more depth to understand where this knowledge has come from. Many of you have seen the Disclosure Project witnesses, and there will be parts of this information scattered throughout their testimony, but I'm trying to pull it together into a 3-hour condensed package so you kind of get your minds around it. Keep in mind that only 1 in 10 Disclosure Project military intelligence and corporate witnesses, about 1 in 10, have been willing to go on videotape and be identified to the public. 90% do not want to be. There are some recent ones since the movie Unacknowledged came out that have surfaced that are really the most important yet and most current, who have been in certain unacknowledged special access projects, which are the deep black projects. That's the proper name. It's where the title came from, Unacknowledged. And I want to put together for all of you today an understanding of the cosmology that's gotten very mixed up in the UFO subculture with the knowledge that I've gained since 1990, having been dealing with various people in the intelligence community, which I will call IC from here on, and military and corporate world who have worked in this space, dealing with extraterrestrial technology, zero-point energy, extraordinary electromagnetic field propulsion and communication systems, etc. There's over 950 of these top secret sources that I have now. And we started out with about a dozen, and by the Disclosure Project we had a few hundred, about 70, 80 came forward on videotape. It's now 10 times that. And with that has been some frustration for me, and I want to share it with you. Because in an ideal world, all of those people would come forward, name, rank, and serial number. But we don't live in an ideal world. And as a physician, I respect the confidential information that people give me. So if it's confidential and they ask that I keep their name and identity confidential, I keep it confidential. That, however, puts me in a very bad position because I'm walking around in my little random access memory with 28 years of information from about 1,000 of these people. And that's hard. Really hard. You know, you're just going, how do I get this out to the public? So what I'm trying to do today and in the next few webinars that I'll do over the next 6 months or so is to provide as much of that information to the public as we can. And I think it's important for people to appreciate that I'm not in a position to force anyone to identify themselves. What I will try to do is give you their provenance, what command they were in, the kinds of information they were read into. Read into means briefed in military speak, and how I came about that when appropriate. In general, I think it's more important to focus on the knowledge and the information than the source per se. I don't repeat things from questionable sources. I question, everyone. They have to provide me proof that they were in the command. They have to give me their badges, send them to me, sometimes physically send them to me if it's a classified badge, and I have to see this. So that's what I rely on. And that's why the Disclosure Project has been and is the gold standard for people all over the world for finding out about this issue. That's really what I want to share, and it's from those sorts of sources and methods, as they say in the intelligence community. But before we can even get into that, we have to start with something more fundamental, and that is, what is this thing called reality that we live in, the cosmos? And I know this sounds like, well, what does that have to do with these unacknowledged special access projects and their technologies and facilities? Everything. Because if you don't understand what's sitting in front of you on the screen right here, there's no way you're going to understand the kinds of technologies we're going to cross over into very quickly today. So first I want to go through this concept of, everyone knows about the conventional universe, 3D, 4D if you consider time a dimension, some do, some don't. It's the material universe, space-time, matter, light and dark matter, dark energy, et cetera, and so on. That's what astrophysicists, star systems, galaxies, subatomic particles, conventional physics and conventional understanding. Then there's the conscious universe, and there are other dimensions connected to the conscious universe. And you see where I've done sort of an overlap. So we have a physical body, but we're conscious, and we can be aware of awareness. And because we can become aware of awareness, we can remote view, we can see the future, see the past, and of course the masters and rishis of old could teleport, materialize, dematerialize, etc. So all conscious, higher intelligent life forms have the ability to manifest. That's a strange sound, it's like from that horror movie. It have the ability to do affect the physical world and the physical cosmos in ways that an interstellar, transdimensional extraterrestrial civilization can. This is lesson number one. It's a hard lesson. It's a really deep one. So if you can imagine all the stories you've heard of the masters of old, or even people in the modern era who have levitated, well, you can do a levitation, mass cancellation, so-called anti-gravity, through resonant field electromagnetic systems. Now let's talk about remote viewing. Everybody's heard of remote viewing, CIA programs, DARPA, DIA. I know a lot of these guys. Well, that's the ability to be a seer and use consciousness to see something at a remote distance or a remote point in space-time. But that can be done through augmentation using electromagnetic systems, which is what interstellar civilizations have and covert programs have. This is the part that you're not going to hear and see in Hollywood. That's what you're going to hear about today. So you'll see that I put that extraterrestrial civilizations, all of them, that are higher intelligent sentient life forms, that's how I'm defining this. They're capable of being aware of awareness. And humans, and then there's this subsection here, covert technologies that are augmented by the study of ET systems and transdimensional stagecraft. These are the ones that are going to be a big deep dive in a few moments. You understand? Because it isn't just, everyone thinks that the secret technologies have to do with Lockheed Martin and Northrop's and Boeing's anti-gravity, black triangles, and flying saucers and things like that, which they do have and have had since the 50s, perhaps a little sooner in terms of prototypes or a little earlier. However, this part has not been looked at by the public, and this is what I want to pull the curtain back. Because there's what I call a strange phenomenon going on, where you have sort of a Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, pulling strings and levers, scaring the hell out of people with stuff that looks other dimensional and looks extraterrestrial, but is being run from an unacknowledged special access project. And I know who they are, where they're operating from, what their technologies are, and what their modus operandi is. That you need to know. And you need to know it 50 years ago with the advent of those. So that is why this is its own, and this, we'll see a later slide. Now, in the other conscious dimensions, we'll take a quick trip through these. Probably everyone in this room, if it was a physics class, they'd be going, huh? But everyone in this room presumably knows what this is. But let's relate it. Let's pretend there's someone here from the School of Physics. You're conscious and awake. You go to sleep at night. You awaken in a lucid dream where you're flying. And that dream ends up being precognitive. You see something that happens the next day or the next week or the next year. This is a lucid precognitive dream. How many people have had one at some point in their life? Very large percentage of this audience. Most humans have, although most scientists won't admit to it because they don't want to be discredited. I, on the other hand, as a medical doctor, didn't care what people thought. I said, you know, if you don't believe it, fine. Fuck off. Anyway. Charming. Okay, so that is actually an activation of the astral cosmos and an interface between yourself and the so-called spirit world. And during such an experience, you may have an encounter with an ancestral being, someone who was on this planet before you. It could have been a grandmother or grandfather. My great aunt, who I was very close to, visited me the day she passed away and came into my room that night. And I saw her as a 30 or 40-year-old, beautiful, and then she went off. And she said goodbye to me that way. That was a very real experience. I didn't even know she had passed away. I found out the next day. That is a very real experience. And then there are other consciousness that are entities that are not human, but not ET. All right? This is the part that gets everyone stumbled. And these are beings that reside in other conscious dimensions and other dimensions that are not physical planets with physical star systems with material bodies, but they're conscious, they're living, they're thinking, they're volitional, they have will, and they can push into an interface with this dimension under certain conditions. And those are, strictly speaking, interdimensional beings of different kinds. And some have had experiences with what they would call very high angelic-like beings. Others have had experiences with some very rather unfriendly entities and what have you. And so those are absolutely real, and they can be quantified in some of the classified labs. And in fact, the technologies that exist in very advanced laboratories can tap into those dimensions and bring them into this dimension. There's such a project going on right now in Salt Lake City. So I think that what you have to understand is that these other dimensional realms have beings that are neither human nor extraterrestrial as you would think of extraterrestrial, meaning someone from another star system, from another planet, with a spacecraft, and it's traveling across the distances of space-time using advanced technological systems. But as they do so, here's the confusion. There's an intersection. They are crossing into the ETs that are in this material cosmos have technologies that look like this. They look like that. What do I mean? You're not going to take an object and accelerate this to the speed of light and beyond to go from the Andromeda galaxy to here, that's 2.5 million light years away. Why? Because in this form, as it would approach light speed, it would take on infinite mass. Therefore, you employ a type of physics, resonant field, high-frequency physics, where this, all the elements within it, subatomic, atomic, molecular, resonantly, if you understand spin theory, we won't get into too much of the physics of this, tilts it out of this dimension into the, let's call it, near astral. This, the interface between this and the astral, between your body and the astral, there's an interface. There's a layer that you can slip along. And that's how you go from one star system to another. And I'm dropping a very big secret here. Because this is why people will see an extraterrestrial vehicle and it will vanish in front of their eyes. People say, oh, it cloaked itself. It didn't just cloak itself. You could walk straight through it. It has shifted out of this dimension just enough, tilting. Let's take the spin and angular momentum of the subatomic and molecular structure of that craft and everyone on board. A little bit out of this fixed linear space-time so that it can appear to disappear and dematerialize. And then, boom, it pops on over the outback of Australia a nanosecond later, or instantaneously. Or it simply bilocates. We'll get into this. Again, one of the Vedic cities of the ancient Vedas, cities are the powers and abilities and consciousness that developed, is bilocation, trilocation, dematerialization, levitation, solid objects going through another solid object. All of those cities that can be developed, SIDDHIS, are abilities that are innately within every human being, but also every extraterrestrial, but they can become routinized or scientifically applied by civilizations advanced enough in their science and technology. Does this make sense? So here's where you get a big confusion, because there are a lot of people having experiences with these, and even beings that are not even in the astral, but in the pure thought realm, and they will think it's extraterrestrial because they know it's not human. Guess what? It's neither. And so there has to be this discernment, because in the UFO space, there are a lot of different phenomena, plural, being described as one phenomenon. Big mistake. That is the first fundamental mistake of the UFO studies area. And it needs to be corrected, because it's being exploited by the intelligence community to fool everybody. This is where I'm going with this. Does this make sense yet? Or I lost anyone? Okay, this is sort of your introductory thing about the cosmology here. The reason, understanding this seems really arcane, but let me give you a couple examples besides the lucid precognitive dream. Let's say, I'll give you an example of a Lockheed Martin Skunk Works guy. Now, here's a little interesting story. A lot of these military witnesses, it's kind of transactional. I hate to use that term. They come to me to give me information because they want to pick my brain about stuff they don't understand. Does that make sense? Okay, but that's fine. I'm happy to teach. The word doctor, docere, from the Latin means to teach, so there you are. So this one man approached me, and Don Phillips, Lockheed Skunk Works, and he was just going to be a military and Skunk Works witness dealing with a radar case of these objects at a Skunk Works facility where he was working. And you can read his testimony in the book and also on our YouTube site, which is youtube.com/sdisclosure. as in serious disclosure, S-disclosure. So that has about 70 of these top secret military witnesses up there for anyone to see who wants to take the time to look at all of it. But one of the reasons he contacted me, he told me the story. He says, I'm happy to be a witness to this. It happened ages ago in the 60s or something. But I really want to know something and have explained to me something that I've never understood. Because back many years ago, he was studying to be a Rosicrucian. And he was going through some training program to do what's called astral projection. I've never taken the course, but apparently they're trained to go from their physical body and then go out with their astral body and under volition have a controlled sort of journey. And he was really studying this hard. And finally one day his teacher came in and said, look, Don, you're ready to do this. You're just mentally, intellectually hung up on it. Just let go, relax, go lay down on your bed and do it, and just intend that you can do it, which is a really key point to meditation and doing the cities. You just intend that you can as if you can, and you do, right? Okay, so he did it, and sure enough, boom, he launched up out of his body, but as he called it, an uncontrolled launch, went up through the ceiling of his house and the roof of his house into the atmosphere, and he went up to and slammed into an extraterrestrial vehicle that was up in high orbit and he recognized instantly what it was. Now, anyone who's had a lucid dream or an out-of-body experience, you know that what you see is even more real than this looks here. It's like this hyper-reality. It's beautiful. And that's what you experience in your near-death experiences as well. But in his case, here was this ET craft, and it was up in the atmosphere. But he says, I don't understand. I wasn't in my physical body. I wasn't in this. But when I hit the craft, it moved. And he said, I should have just gone right through it, but how could the density of my astral energy light body affect the ET craft this way? I said, because they were of like density. The ET craft, if anyone was looking up in the sky, would have not have been visible. It would have been shifted into the, quote, near astral. And there was enough similarity of the resonant frequency of that astral body that you launched out into the sky with, and the ET vehicle that was shifted just out of 3D and 4D, but was hovering there. They don't have to be traveling that way. They can just hover. You won't even see them. You have to sense them. And he did tell a funny story. He said, well, it was really kind of embarrassing because I popped into the inside of this craft, and there were these ETs at a console that looked at me like, my God, why don't you watch where you're going? And you clumsy cosmic traveler. And he was actually quite embarrassed by it. I said, well, yeah, it was an interplanetary diplomatic faux pas. You don't just barge in. Now, that's a really true story. He didn't understand this. He was a scientist, and he was also someone who had worked in a lot of classified projects, and he understood the human experience of the spirit world, let's call it, and the astral body and near-death experiences and things like this. But he did not understand why the extraterrestrial vehicle would have been affected by his astral body that way and actually bumped and moved. And I said, well, because at that point, it was shifted into an energy form that was very similar to the density, the quantifiable, and it is quantifiable, density of your spirit body, your astral body. He says, oh, that makes sense. I said, yeah, it's actually not hard to figure this out once you understand this. If you understand the entirety of all that exists is consciousness, shifting and phasing in different densities, and that includes this podium and everything. Everything is conscious. And everything is consciousness phasing in a different way. Now, luckily, before I was a meditation teacher, I became a before I was a doctor, I became a meditation teacher with Marion and Jeff Kramer, who are here from the local area. 44 years ago, we met out at MIU and became meditation teachers together in my misspent youth. It was awesome. And it was very good that I did that before I went into medicine and all of this, because it laid a foundation for me to understand what is the reality, not only of the human condition, the deep spiritual cosmic level of human potential, but also of space and time, which is also conscious. The entire cosmos is a conscious hologram that is awake, and everything in it. Now, the civilizations that have figured out how to go from one star system to another have mastered the science of consciousness very well. And they understand that, and then they can develop technologies where it interfaces with, say, communication systems, so that they have a little black box. No, it's not an Apple iPhone, but it'll be a little thing, and they can think to it, and it transmits the information, thought to thought, person to person. So you can say, well, couldn't you do that telepathically? Yes, you can, but there's a factor of error there. Whereas if it can be done scientifically and precisely, then you develop that capability, which is what they have. But it also means they have those technologies that cross over into the propulsion systems, teleportation systems, materialization, dematerialization, etc. These are all the things that began to be drilled down on hard between the early 20th century and today. So about 100 years of classified research. We're going to get into this. Therefore, if it sounds confusing to you, it's only because you have to stop for a moment and think, what is within me? I have a physical body. I'm in this physical room on a physical planet going around a physical star. But I also have within me my body of light, the essence of my reality, the causation, the thought being, the tone within yourself. There is actually a resonant tone, like a mantra, but it's unique to everything in creation. That is like a standing wave that manifests, and it's called the thought, sound component of thought. That's what a mantra is. And then deep within us is this transcendent level of consciousness. And we're all part and parcel of that field. And that's why there is no separation in space and time once you understand that every point in space and time and all matter, this is where entanglement theory and what Einstein called the spooky effect, where he observed that something in one place was affecting another place instantaneously, and he called it spooky. But that's what non-locality in physics is. Right? You've all heard of non-locality. This is the ultimate non-locality, is this state of transcendent consciousness, which, FYI, is folded within every single one of you. What the samadhi state is what you sit and you meditate and you enter into that. And sometimes you get it clearly, sometimes you don't, but that's what the meditative process can lead to. And some people call that awakening or enlightenment or what have you. It's really the ordinary state of consciousness. You are always that, whether you recognize it or not. That's the beauty of this. Now, your individual ego may not recognize it or even understand it, but then phenomena happens, like intuition, precognition, lucid dreams, etc., and so on. And miraculous things, where you hear about people who suddenly are able to pick up or almost levitate a car off a child, way beyond what any human strength should be able to do when they need to, because they put their intention on it. So, you see what I'm saying? So, we all have that within us, every single one of us, but also every single extraterrestrial being. So just remember that as we go through this. Now, that capability can be exploited for the good, the common good, for enlightenment, for healing, free energy, all kinds of things. Or it can be used as a weapon system. So I'm not trying to scare the hell out of you, but by the end of this, you will be. And, but don't be. But you probably will be, but I'm going to tell you at the end why you shouldn't be. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And this is a little more of a deep dive into what we call alien. And the reason I want to call this out for what it is, I mentioned it a moment ago, there are all kinds of phenomena being called alien. And I've met with people who've had encounters with, like a poltergeist. You know what a poltergeist is? Somebody who's passed away and comes in and is, moves something around. They say, "Oh, it was an alien in my house." Well, it was no such thing. It was not an extraterrestrial biological life form from another planetary system. It was someone who lived in that house 200 years ago and is pissed off that he died somehow, unfortunately. I tell a great classic story of this. And so this gets into, this sort of experience where they're in another dimension, they're not in the physical body anymore. The ancestral spirits, poltergeists, astral dimensions, there can be lower and higher frequency, all the way to angelic and celestial. But I was in the emergency department once. I don't know if you've heard this story, but it's illustrative. And it finally was quiet for 1 nanosecond. But previously, a man had died in one of the trauma rooms, and it was a violent death, a murder, and he was intoxicated, and he was not a happy camper. And about 3 or 4 in the morning, in the room in which he passed away, now the whole emergency department's empty. Now I'm sitting there with the nurses and the secretary, and we're just sort of hanging out till the next case comes in. Suddenly, the EKG machine turns on, the cabinets open, the IV bags start being thrown out of the cabinet, and the IV pole, the drip, beep, beep, drip, all that turns on. And the whole thing is like a whirlwind goes in this one little room, and it's this guy pissed off. He's really mad. I did a little prayer where I connected him to the most great light that's within all things and us, and sent him on his way, and he stopped. And the nurses say, "What did you do?" I said, "Well, I just kind of connected him to where he needs to go." But this sort of thing, almost all critical care medical people have a story like this. And in the emergency department, you saw a lot of it. Now, that wasn't an alien. That was a guy who just had been murdered, who was very intoxicated and who was furious, and came in and was able with his spirit body to push into this dimension a little bit. And that's what poltergeist is. It's like the movie Ghost with Demi Moore. Have you ever seen it? No. So, and that phenomenon is absolutely real. Now, a lot of people have had experiences with beings from other dimensions that are not extraterrestrial that can have that effect in this plane, and they will think it's an ET, and it isn't. It's really important for you to get this. So what is being called alien and what has been kind of thrown all together into one category are actually extraterrestrial, and these are the ones that are transdimensional interstellars. I call them TDIS. These are ET beings capable of interstellar travel using these advanced transdimensional technologies where they go from one point in space-time to another, but not in a linear way. They're dropping out of linear space-time and traversing these dimensions, which means that they're not limited by the normal limitations on matter and space and time. Because otherwise, there'd be no way they could go from another star system to here. That's how they're doing it. But there are also ETs that people can have experiences with that are planetary bound. Let's say that, I doubt anyone in this room travels around to different galaxies. Maybe, I don't know, but unlikely. But in consciousness, you could go to another planet, and you could actually visit an ET civilization, and you may see one that is at our stage of development or even perhaps more primitive. And that is through the field of consciousness and the ability to remote view and teleport. using this subtle body. So people have had experiences with both interstellar transdimensional ETs that are passing through other dimensions, but are from other star systems and planets, but also ones that can be remote viewed or seen or experienced in consciousness. And some of those civilizations could also get here and visit, but without a spacecraft. They don't have that technology yet. Just like the Aboriginals had dream time as a routine way that they communicated at night in Australia. You know that story. And that's how they would know what to do the next day. And they'd meet a friend in the outback, and they know where to intersect at some remote area because they did it during their dream. Well, you could do that. If you can do it 10 miles away, you can do it a billion light years away. Because you've transcended space-time limitation. Does this make sense yet? All right. I mean, it's very abstract ideas, but I'm trying to relate them to personal experiences that all of you have had, I'm sure. So now you're talking about civilizations that have, the ones that are interstellar, have very advanced artificial intelligence. What do I mean by that? Their spacecraft are bio-nano machines. Every special operations force guy I've dealt with who's come up across one of these objects that we have downed using electromagnetic weapons we'll get to in a moment, since the 40s, that's what Roswell was, will tell you that the craft themselves were living, and the craft themselves were conscious. They were conscious to the point that AI, the artificial intelligence associated with the spacecraft, was at the level that the craft emanated the consciousness of the pilot. And the craft itself has a living, organic quality to it, even though it's a machine. So it's a bio-nano machine that's conscious. That's very different from the clunky things Lockheed Martin's making. I'm giving you a little hint here of how you can tell the difference between a covert military UFO and an actual ET spacecraft, interstellar, transdimensional. Zing, got it? Little teachable moment there when you go out into the stars and you're watching. So those spacecraft that are interstellar have this ability to emanate the consciousness of the occupants. And they actually have their function and movement according to the thought. Now, often they're touching a panel and thinking, and then the craft will go here or there or what have you, or materialize or dematerialize. Very, very advanced stuff. Not your 777, Boeing 777. Now, so these, so the craft are interfacing with the beings, but then their communication systems are doing, there are two ways that this is happening. There's technology that is assisting their consciousness. So let's say they want to see another star system on a planet called Earth, and they may be a billion light years from here. They can connect to that, and it is an augmentation system, a magnification system that is electromagnetic but very advanced, that enables them to see using consciousness. So the technology is assisting the remote viewing function that is innately within all sentient beings. Does this make sense? But there's the reverse, and that's the consciousness-assisted technology. So there are technologies on board, all the technologies on board these ET craft can also be interfacing with the consciousness and thought, in coherent thought, not random, but very directed, coherent, intent thought of the ETs on board. How many people have had a fairly close encounter and seen a craft and felt that it was awake? Felt that the craft itself was awake? Yeah, they are. But they're awake. They're actually just an extension of the consciousness of the occupants. I know, this gets into some weird stuff fast in the first 35 minutes, but we're going to get into a lot weirder stuff pretty fast. So the very high-level ETs, their consciousness would be similar to these. So the civilizations that have been around 10 to the 7th, 10 to the 8th, 10 to the 9th years, millions to a billion years longer than we have. Both their technologies and their consciousness would be at the celestial/angelic level, but they still have planetary systems, star systems, physical worlds. But everyone on that planet, even at the time of birth, is born into a state of cosmic consciousness and enlightenment at the time of birth. Eventually, humans will evolve into one of those level 12 civilizations. We're a level 0, by the way. Michikaku makes this thing. We have to get to level 1, which means you're peaceful, not destroying your environment, and not killing each other. Well, we ain't got there yet, all right? We're trying to, right? That's what we're working towards. Well, some of us. Most people, 90+%. So that's another thing to remember. In our CE5 expeditions, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, we'll be having an experience where the experience with an ET civilization will be very similar to an experience with one of the higher angelic celestial, but they're not, and they have spacecraft. I loved it when Monsignor Balducci, the senior theologian at the Vatican, that Paula Harris, who couldn't be with us today, she's in Europe, introduced me to, and he was a senior theologian to Pope John Paul, and he said to me, angels and demons don't need flying saucers. Simple statement, true statement. Think about it. And we had a wonderful discussion, and his testimony is in the disclosure material as well as the senior astronomer for the Vatican Observatory and Project. Most people haven't read it. It's there, and they confirm all of this. But my point is, the civilizations that are extraordinarily advanced are going to really look like magic. Now, I have to point out to people, let's take a step back to all the, sort of time-centered, reductionist scientific people on the planet listening to this. This cell phone, if you went back in time and handed this to Thomas Jefferson, or worse, to Salem, Massachusetts, you would be considered a warlock, a witch, something. I mean, to have something and be showing a video on this from another part of the world, everything we're using today would look like magic to someone only 200 years ago. Now let's extrapolate our technological development that we know about in the non-classified world, the world of CNN and the New York Times, i.e. lame. Well, they don't know anything, and they're not going to know anything. So, to quote Spook, the first time I was going to brief the CIA director, he says, the president and the CIA director don't know anything, and they're not going to know anything. That's how he worded it. What a nasty piece of work. Anyway, so this is something for you to think about, is that if we're talking about civilizations that are in the thousands to millions of years more developed than we are, extrapolate how we've developed since, say, the early 1800s to now, 200 years. And factor in that about 100 years of that period, the big breakthroughs in science, technology, energy, propulsion, anti-gravity, even consciousness technologies have been suppressed and sequestered into unacknowledged special access projects. Now extrapolate a few thousand years forward. That's who and what we're dealing with. One civilization we had contact with at Joshua Tree was a senior ambassador named Bijou that we took a photo of. Some of you have seen it. And when I was asking him, what his IQ was, we had a series of electromagnetic devices that we were using for binary yes-no confirming communication with the civilization. I said, my sense is that your IQ is around 450. And it signaled yes. And so, most average Americans, 110, 115. And it's an algorithmic scale. So you're dealing with civilizations that are very, very advanced, incredibly intelligent, highly conscious. And we have to figure their technologies are going to be a corollary, are going to parallel that development. Now, the good news is we're also developing that way. They've done studies with meditators. People who meditate actually have their IQs go up. Everyone's told that you're stuck with what you're born with. Not true. Not true. They actually can go up as you develop higher states of consciousness. We'll get into this, and this is another subject. But so imagine civilizations that have been involved with conscious evolution with technological corollaries for thousands to millions of years longer than we have. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. So this phenomenon of interdimensional weirdness often gets lumped into this experience with actual ETs. And then you get into the mother of all clusterfucks, as the Marines call it. And it's, excuse my French, but the French would be, mon Dieu, that's not French. But this, where you're dealing with classified, unacknowledged, special access projects that have the ability, and have had the ability since the 50s and 60s, to simulate, like a simulator, alien experiences. And just a short list of those would be things that look like UFOs that have been termed ARVs, alien reproduction vehicles. These were first being worked on in the 40s and 50s. I have a gentleman that I've been meeting with whose father is a member of the Majority Intelligence Committee, MAGIC, and a senior U.S. Senator, former senior U.S. Senator. And, you know, he was talking about the fact that his grandfather, Paul Mellon, had gone over to Germany at the end of World War II and retrieved the secret weapon that Hitler was working on, and that was a disc. And it was and they also had a bell that was electromagnetic-gravitic, sort of anti-gravity. But they hadn't worked out the bugs. They couldn't really control. They would wobble and crash, and they hadn't got it perfected. We got the atomic bomb before they perfected the anti-gravity devices. However, Paul Mellon, who along with Alan Dulles and a few other people were key to founding the CIA, went over with George Patton, General Patton, and brought it back to the United States along with the top Nazi scientists under Operation Paperclip. And that mainstream history books have been written about Operation Paperclip. This is not a conspiracy theory. And you know, these were people like Herman Oberth and Werner von Braun and a lot of other really brilliant scientists who had worked on these sort of technologies, brought them in, and they became the foundation of our not only intelligence community, but our early aerospace research and development community in the United States, which my uncle, who worked on the lunar module, was involved with Northrop Grumman, but they were, you know, a generation before him even in the 40s. So an interesting side note, George Patton wanted to disclose these technologies to the public for the good of humanity. He was assassinated by the Wet Works teams. Wet Works are assassination squads, because he wanted to do so. And the result is, during the Eisenhower years, the projects that were dealing with this area of research, both extraterrestrial and man-made, came together in these unacknowledged special access projects, although they were run into separate compartments. So let me explain what I mean here. And you had all the way back to the 20s, T. Townsend Brown, working with very high voltage frequency systems where, in crystalline materials, where he would have objects levitate, right? This is a matter of public record. And his work then got pulled into the RAND Corporation, and the Air Force, later into the Air Force. But there were also experiments going on in Germany, the Klossky-Frost experiment and some others in the late 20s. So by the time the 40s came around, there had been a lot of experimentation with VHV, I call it, very high voltage systems that at certain cycles per second, let's call it hertz, and resonant fields and combined resonant fields with specialized materials, crystalline materials and what have you, would result in a lifter effect, anti-gravity effect, mass cancellation. So those got developed between the 20s and the 40s. This is why I call the chapter in that book and in the movie, The Lost Century. There's a whole lost century of technology. We're running around with jet engines and cars running ExxonMobil gasoline unnecessarily for 100 years. And we're paying the price now for the environment and geopolitically. But keep in mind that these technologies were on the radar scope of classified projects long before the end of World War II. A man who lived here in Denver, some of you may have known Dr. Altshuler. How many people knew Dr. Altshuler? He was a hematologist, pathologist, wonderful man. He's passed away. His uncle was General Jimmy Doolittle of World War II. And all of you have heard of Foo Fighters, I presume. Well, not the band. So Dave Grohl named the band after this, what I'm about to tell you. Foo Fighters were these things that we call UFOs in World War II that were zipping around our aircraft and what have you. We thought it was a covert Axis, German technology. The Germans thought it was a covert Allied U.S. British technology. So FDR, Roosevelt, sent General Doolittle over to the theater of operations to look into this. And he looked into it and studied it and came back and told FDR, this was in the 40s, early mid-40s, and said, sir, those are interplanetary vehicles, quote unquote. So this goes back at least 70-some years and probably longer. The part that people forget is that the human mind and an extraterrestrial mind can discover the same laws of the universe because the laws of the universe are universal. Important point. Very important point. So there was this accelerating discovery of electromagnetic, trans-dimensional, and anti-gravity sciences in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s that then got potentiated greatly by the retrieval of extraterrestrial vehicles, the most notorious being the Roswell crash, which I'm sure you've all heard of, but that is by no means the only one, nor was it the first one. There were ones in the 30s and 40s. And those extraterrestrial technologies were then put into a compartmented operation, TSSCI, top secret, special compartmented information or intelligence, that was unacknowledged, to be studied. And then there were people doing at the same time work in the conventional anti-gravity, let's call it, electromagnetogravitics is what it is properly called, anti-gravity and other systems. And there are very few that would communicate between the two. That was a highly specialized group of people that could cross between the conventional R&D labs that were classified and unacknowledged and the extraterrestrial research projects that were also unacknowledged, because compartmentalization is the name of the game of secrecy. A man who's recently surfaced and is working with me has been in, was cleared to 18 of these unacknowledged special access projects, or USAPs, and he's providing me information about these 18 projects, and he was in them between 2002 and 2012. So it's a lot of current information. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, what I'm trying to portray here is something you need to know historically, because everyone will say, oh, we have these spacecraft that are ARVs at Lockheed Martin, in Northrop, and Boeing, and all these outfits that are in EG&G. Those are, people say, oh, those were all based on ET spacecraft. They were not. They're a combination of man-made breakthroughs in science and technology that was classified, being pushed along by the study of extraterrestrial technologies, which is a much heavier lift, much harder to do, because you're looking at something you have no clue what it could be used for. The other part of that's being developed and has been developed for some years is this area, the programmed life forms. These are what people normally call aliens, the grays, the this, the that. I know men who've worked in those labs making these little creatures. They're kind of boogamy. They're sort of creepy, but they have integrated circuits in their cortex, but they are also biological. So there's a genetic program that will take genetic material from a dead or living extraterrestrial, develop it, and then put in integrated circuits, and then create a sort of robotic creature that passes quite well as an alien. There's a man who has lived in the area named Stan Romanek, and Ricky Butterfast, who's here, and I went to go visit him a few years ago. And I'm sure all of you have seen this, heard about his experience with Boo and this ET that was popping up. But what you didn't see, because I think Disney bought up the rights to it, was some footage of one getting into his house when he had his camera running. And there were all these weird electromagnetic effects happening in his house. His medicine bottles, the plastic was melting, and all kinds of weird stuff. And he shows us this video, and I'm sitting there with Ricky and a MUFON, I think, state director, or somebody who researches this issue with MUFON. And it shows this creature coming in, and it's very jerky, kind of moving. And then the camera falls over. They had thrown a chemical canister in. He passes out, has a classic abduction experience. Now, to 99.99999999999% of the population, they've just had an encounter with an alien. Not, they had an encounter with one of these. Got to get your minds around this. Now, have people had real experiences with real ETs? Yes. But they get simulated. And someone who's had an actual experience with a real ET, sometimes to confuse them, will then be targeted with a PLF and an ARV and a lot of other weird stuff we're going to get into to confuse their memory and experience. Counterintelligence programs are quite well developed in this area, quite well, and very good at what they do. So I turned to Stan and the other people. I said, well, that's a PLF. And he said, what's that? I said, you cannot be doing UFO research and not know what a programmed life form is or an ARV is. Since about 80% of the phenomenon being reported is this, not this. This gets blacklisted. These get reported and published. Because the publishing houses, the big media, will be told, cover this, don't cover this. Told you it'd be a mind fuck. So, but, excuse my third time I've used that word, sorry. But I think what you have to begin to understand is that it is. Because, you know, in 1991, 92, 93, when I was first emerging into this area, I didn't think any of this could be possible. It is. And this is what they don't want you to know. They want you to be confused, and they want you to be played to support the alien invasion agenda, which is the big punchline of the secrecy. That and keeping the technology secret, so we have to burn oil and make people trillions of dollars that way. But you have to understand this. These are even more concerning. And this has been going on since at least the 50s that I know about, 1950s. So I'll give you a timeline. Anti-gravity, gravity control, October 1954 is when that was mastered. Programmed life forms were later in the 60s, 70s, 80s. In the 50s and 60s, they were using a lot of stagecraft with people made up to look like an ET. I've talked with some intelligence people who said, oh yeah, we take someone who is very short or very unusual looking and do a certain kind of makeup like in Hollywood and put them on board one of these ARVs and have them abduct somebody. Very effective. Stagecraft, it's called. The electromagnetic interdimensional portals are even of greater concern, and some of you have heard of these sort of events happening in places like Montauk and other facilities where also at the Lockheed Skunk Works. And I remember meeting with the Skunk Works, very highly classified officers. Actually, it was a man who was introduced to me by the head of Lockheed International. And they had a laboratory where they could hook people up to an electromagnetic console, tap into these other dimensions, not ET, and bring into 3D an actual being from that dimension. And it'd be running around the lab like some kind of monster or boogum. Very advanced stuff, be in the hands of some very strange people with an agenda to deceive. Counterintelligence is all about deception. So then, have I lost you all yet? We ain't got started yet, honey. Now, the electromagnetic, so this then leads to these electromagnetic interdimensional beings. And the recent research being done up at Salt Lake City, I've learned in the last couple months, they have a basketball-sized device that can teleport and travel, anti-grav, but also they hit a certain resonant frequency and bang, the laboratory filled up with these interdimensional beings that were visible. They were videotaped. I'm trying to get my hand on the videotape from a national security agency contact I have, but that's just in the last, since March, April. And that's being done in a private lab, privately funded. What that lab doesn't know is that they were doing it in classified U.S. government-supported, unacknowledged special access labs in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Okay? You gotta understand this stuff. You're not gonna know what's gonna happen, what's coming, unless you do. Then there are these little lovely experiences, psychotronically induced experiences with AI and also holographic man-made beings, thought forms. So this is in a whole basket of technologies. And about 1956, I met with a man who was, back in 93, 94, was in his 80s. And he was sort of a very much an electromagnetic genius prodigy back then. And he developed a system, couple systems. One was a TAC system, technology-assisted consciousness system, where you could switch it on, hook yourself up to sort of like a headset, and go into a remote view state and see any place you wanted to. That was 56. A front company for the CIA called Alphametric Corporation bought it up and black-shelled it and put it into their unacknowledged exclusive use for certain highly classified. And I'm not talking Ed Dames type stuff. I mean, way past what Ed was exposed to. So those systems were 50s, 56, 57, 58. He also said that they had technologies where at a remote distance, they could target somebody, and this is thousands of miles away if they wished, and give them an experience with a being that 100% would seem real. It's almost like electromagnetic LSD or electromagnetic ayahuasca, but controlled by the intelligence community. So that, and he said, and I'm quoting here, he said, if we want to target someone so that they have a personal conversation with their personal God, Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, whoever it is, they'll have it, they'll think it's real, and they will absolutely pass a lie detector test that it's real. That's 50s. 60-some years ago. You got to get your mind around that in order to understand people with the intent to deceive have in their collection of tools extraordinary sciences and technologies that are classified. Now, if I had heard this stuff from one person with credentials, I would have questioned it, but it's from dozens and dozens and dozens of people who've been in these companies and in these agencies. A lot of the really high-end work of that is being done in we'll go through a list, E-Systems, Raytheon, EG&G, et cetera, and so on. So that's what you have to understand. And, you know, and the comical term that's used at the CIA by the people I know there currently is WSFM, weird science and frickin' magic. But at Lockheed Martin, at Northrop Grumman, they just call it PFM, pure effing magic. That's what the engineers call it. It absolutely looks like magic. So that is what we're dealing with. Now let's go to the next slide. We're going to get into more detail. Is this too much? Are you following? Yeah? Well, there'll be time for question later. So when you look at the covert intelligence community's USAPs, you have to divide them into two general areas. You have advanced physics, and these are things that you can think of that are very 3D, 4D, ARVs, electromagnetic devices, programmed life forms that are robotic creatures that are bio-nano genetics. By the way, the state-of-the-art lab for that is Dulce. Cannot get to it by being anywhere near Dulce. There's a connector from Los Alamos underground and also some other UGVs. We'll get into that in a moment, where the underground system is connected. But these are the ones that are really where the action is, trans-dimensional physics, both passive and active. Now, the reason I divide these into passive and active systems is that the passive systems are for intelligence gathering and spycraft. The active systems are for disruption and staging things. Does that make sense? So as we look at these passive systems, you're looking at the sort of things that if you were to develop electromagnetic interdimensional spycraft, and it's way past PRISM or the Monroe Institute. When I say way past, way past. PRISM was the Snowden revealed NSA eavesdropping thing. Those are using electromagnetic linear. And these are systems that, as I mentioned, have electromagnetic assisted remote viewing into the conscious realm. And those allow spycraft to take place free of any tap or electromagnetic monitoring of telecommunication, what's called signals intelligence. Not necessary. And this is why everyone who works with me, when they first start working with me, they go, oh, we need to send everything encrypted, and we need this, and I said, don't bother. By the time the thought has left your cerebral cortex, it's been grabbed by these technologies. Now, one of my military advisors for many years was a naval commander, and he, back when the White Oaks Naval Facility was operative, it's closed now in Maryland, he saw a device that was called a white noise space-time electromagnetic extraction system. And what that was is that it was a device that could target anywhere, any volume of space, say the volume in this room, and say the device is there near Bethesda in Maryland. They could target the volume of this room and monitor anything going on now or that happened here last night, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000,000 years ago. It's called the white noise of space-time. The mystics call it the Akashic record. So encoded within the fabric of space-time is everything that has ever happened is still there as a standing energy waveform that can be extracted by this system. And that was in the 70s, and it had been fully operational long before he got there. Called the white noise space-time extraction. Okay, do you understand what that is? So yeah, so it can target it, but it's actually pulling events and information and intelligence out of the structure of space-time and can target any volume anywhere. So this is why I say, Snowden, I told his lawyers, don't, he made a very big mistake disclosing lame stuff like PRISM and the conventional NSA fiber optic going into Google and Facebook. The big action is this stuff. And that's why anyone who wants to work with me, I say, forget about encryption. Forget about secrecy. Ain't going to work, because if you had $1 trillion, you couldn't frustrate these systems. Now, and then there are others that have been developed or they're trying to develop, so-called Project Red Light. That's based on studying extraterrestrial communication devices that can also look into the future or get a sense of future events. Those are in development and are less precise, but that's only because all future events are only probabilities. So let me explain what I mean by that. Everything that we think and do at this moment is changing the future. And so if in this point in time you see an event in the future, by the time you've seen it, if you've shared that information, it can change that event. Does this make sense? So now, it may have a 95% likelihood, it may have a 99%, it may be a 80%, but it's not going to be 100%. The ones looking in the real time now or backward, like the white noise extraction systems, those are extremely accurate. Okay, so those are all passive systems that, and there are many others, that have been developed since the 50s, 60s, 70s. Certainly by the 60s and 70s, these were all fully operational. Okay, so you're not going to learn this in your physics class or your government class at the college here, but you'll learn it today, and I'm telling you the truth. Now, these are worrisome just because they're very unacknowledged special access project spy systems. These are where my bigger concern is. And these active transdimensional systems deal with the ability to perturb or induce phenomenon from other realms and dimensions. I mentioned that a moment ago, where they could set up an electromagnetic vector into another dimension and cause a phenomenon to take place that would not only fool everyone, but could be very injurious to the Earth. One of these systems, I've been told, recently has been deployed in the past to be set up over certain tectonic fault lines to induce earthquakes and earth changes. And these are actively being deployed. Very dangerous game being played. This is why these events coming are going to be not just natural, but man-made and natural. Keep that in mind as things start unfolding. They're in the hands of some of the worst elements possible, which is why I said 25 years ago, the disclosure of this subject and getting these technologies under the control of conscious, ethical people is of the utmost importance to the human future, and it is an existential crisis that it is in the hands of the people it's in. They have had the ability to do teleportation since the 50s, maybe 40s. You've all heard the Philadelphia experiment. It wasn't actually in Philadelphia, it was in Rhode Island, but that was a cover story. But the long story short is the ability to cause an object to switch and fall out of one point in space and appear at another. That has been done fairly recently with particles in physics. It's been reported in mainstream physics journals. But what you need to know is through very high voltage and electromagnetic frequency field systems, it began to be studied and practiced and experimented with in the 40s and 50s. One of our disclosure project witnesses, Fred Threadfell, was up at a base up in Canada that was a classified Air Force facility where they had this big room, and it sounds so prosaic, but they had an ashtray. And the ashtray would be on a box, and it had this electromagnetic field, and it would dematerialize and rematerialize on another part of the base, and they could just teleport it back and forth. An ashtray. That was in 1953. So these sort of sciences, trans-dimensional physics and sciences, have been developed over the last 60, 70 years. At this point in 2018, they're extraordinarily well developed in the classified world, and they can stage pretty much anything they want, which is what they're doing. It also means they can materialize and dematerialize objects. They can weaponize these interdimensional portals, or so-called stargates. Now, this is the thing that is most concerning to me, is that all interstellar extraterrestrial civilization are crossing through these finer dimensions to get here. They're not going through linear solid space-time. But over the last 30, 40 years, they've developed the ability to weaponize, say, a vector or a portal into these other dimensions and then create a weapon system that can target other starcraft, other planetary systems, and what have you. This is very dangerous in the hands of people who have the intention to utilize them. And this is of great concern to all of us. The other are the satellite-based systems. Back in the 70s, I met the man who was a very brilliant electromagnetic engineer, had his own company in the Tampa, St. Pete area, who had developed what he called a neutrino light detector. These are detectors that are placed on satellites that can pick up an ET craft when it's coming out of interdimensional, transdimensional space-time into this dimension, and it leaves a certain signature. And it's not conventional light. It's a neutrino kind of light scatter, but in the shape and form and vector of the spacecraft. That is then slaved, as they call, to weapon systems that are both in space on satellites and on the ground to target the ET craft and hit it with a very powerful electromagnetic weapon, which is how we've been causing these crash retrieval events to happen. Though you're not going through billions of miles or light years of space and getting here and running out of gas and crashing. I mean, or an electrical storm. They don't know how to maneuver through well, 737s can go around electrical storms. They're being targeted with these weapons that are faster than the speed of light because they are what are called scalar or longitudinal. So a quick study in that. Wave, like light you're seeing, has a wave function, right? So the wave function is 186,000 miles per second propagating. Scalar or longitudinal, it's a point in a line, and it doesn't have a wave function, and it is multiples of the speed of light. Those scalar systems or longitudinal systems have been developed since the 40s, 50s, 60s, and have been weaponized. That was what was in the little secret radar dome. The FBI memo that we got has now become the #1 viewed document on the FBI website from the field agent to J. Edgar Hoover about the Roswell event, where it says apparently they switched on a, quote, new radar system, and these things crashed. It wasn't radar the way you think of radar at Denver International Airport. That term radar, just so you know, is a euphemism used in unacknowledged special access projects to denote these sort of specialized pulsed electromagnetic weapon systems. And they call them radar. It's a euphemism. So these have been developed and were deployed in the 70s. There were systems in the 60s that were present in space, but they weren't as accurate because they didn't have these very subtle neutrino light detectors on them. And of course, then you have the land, air, and sea-based systems that aren't in space that have these interdimensional and scalar electromagnetic weapons. A good example would be near Eglin Air Force Base. There's an area of beach there that's classified, and they have these big horseshoe-shaped objects that are connected to satellite tracking systems. And when they have picked up ET craft coming in, they'll switch it on and hit it with the equivalent of something much more powerful than an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, like you'd get from a nuclear weapon, but it's very directional, and it will disable the ET craft, and it'll drop straight out of the sky into the Gulf, and they'll go and retrieve it. I know people who've been on those retrieval teams. What? Yep. You now understand why the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the 3-star general I met with, in the first 10 minutes said, "Dr. Greer, we don't know why you haven't committed suicide yet." That was his first question. Why haven't you? And then there are the mind-conscious interface weapons. These are ones, that get into radionic, psychotronic disruptors. Very worrisome, because if you take, the concept of technology interfacing with mind and consciousness, and you were to weaponize it, then you can create a system that not only gathers intelligence, but disrupts people's function or level of consciousness, or can induce as I mentioned earlier, hallucinogenic abduction states. But also, importantly, can disrupt amity, can disrupt relationships. There was a woman back in 93 or 94 who I met with for about a week who had worked in one of these corporations. And she says, look, we have devices and we can turn a dial, target a board meeting in New York City, and have the board come to the decision we want them to come to. Or we can turn the dial the other way. Everyone in the room is fighting with each other, hating each other. The egos come out. And these are very well-developed systems. Sounds like tinfoil hat stuff. And that's what they want you to believe. But those systems have been fully operational also since the 50s and 60s. So this is just sort of a quick overview of the constellation of types of technologies. I think you're getting the gist of this. Everything you've learned is wrong about this subject. Most of it is stagecraft. You have to have this information to go to the next level of what you need to do, and that's to become an interplanetary ambassador to these civilizations. Because I don't think it's going to happen out of the US State Department or the UN anytime soon. And it is very important that you not give any power to this, but you have to be aware of it. And what do I mean by that? The consciousness within us and the central sun of reality, that state of conscious being, that's so much more powerful than these toys. But you have to access that state to frustrate them. It's just being a Shambhala warrior, spirit warrior. You have to understand the power of the consciousness within you. And the conscious mind that you're awake with right now is actually seamlessly integrated to the unbounded infinite mind of the great being at all times, in all places. So you can connect to that, transcend your own ego and individuality and fear and intellect, and connect to that, and that is the ultimate protection. But it's also the ultimate source of guidance, wisdom, discernment. That's why I said it was a very good thing I became a meditation teacher and a student of the Vedas and the cities and what have you before I got involved with this, because otherwise I would have been lost for sure, probably killed too. So this is very important for you to understand as a sort of milieu, sort of the prevailing environment that is extant. It's out there, it's operational, it's fully operational, and it's being deployed all the time. It's the stock and trade of most things ufological. So I think we have to begin to, and I had someone say to me once, "Boy, you're really a skeptic about most." I said, "No, it's not a skepticism. It's about knowledge. I've known all of this since the early and mid-90s. Terrible. Well, and of course, what do you do when you're meeting with a politician? And I had dinner night before last before I flew out here with one of the main editor of Politico and a former ambassador under Bill Clinton and some people in D.C. I have a home in D.C. and I meet with a lot of these kind of folks. And you're trying to bring them up to ET and UFO 101, that they even exist. But they need to know this. But they don't. And it's a huge learning curve. It's vertical. And all of us have got to go through this learning curve very quickly so we don't get fooled again. Imagine this constellation of technologies being deployed to simulate an alien attack, simulate abductions, mutilations, and as Dr. Altshuler, who is a wonderful man who lived here in Denver, I'd stay at his home, and he was remember the Snippy the horse, the original mutilated animal thing? That was him. That was the doctor who researched that in the late 68 or something. He says, "Oh yeah," he says, "I discovered those were covert paramilitary programs doing those back in the late 60s. Nobody would listen." I said, "Oh yeah, of course they are. We know how they're doing it and why they're doing it." It's really funny. Everyone says, the aliens are mutilating the cattle. I said, yeah, right. I know exactly who's doing it, where they're operating out of, what technologies they're using, and they've been doing it since the 60s. Now, to the hysterical public, the aliens are mutilating our cattle and women folk, and they're doing this and they're doing that. I'm going, yeah, well, they're alien, but they're not extraterrestrial. Go back to the previous slide, and you'll see alien is a catch-all. So what part of this is extraterrestrial? What part of it is interdimensional? What part of it innately interdimensional? And what part of it is man-made simulators using very advanced technologies that, who knows how many trillions of dollars, at least 8 trillion in one Michigan State University study recently, $21 trillion in covert money have gone into. Our entire national debt, by the way, would be all set if we could claw back the 21 trillion that have been embezzled into these projects. Yeah. So it's a lot of money. And with it comes a lot of technology and a lot of brilliant people. The smartest people I have ever met on this planet that are not ET have been people who have been identified in high school and college and pulled into a USAP. Unacknowledged Special Access Project. IQ's 200 and north. I mean, just geniuses. And what a waste. Because they're spending their lives working for these fascists who have an agenda of World War III being interplanetary, just as Werner von Braun warned on his deathbed. So if you take all of this in the aggregate and realize that people say, when is the false flag going to happen? I said, well, that started in the 50s. The false flag operators started in the 50s when they developed alien reproduction vehicles, gravity control, then started doing stagecraft simulating ET encounters that scared people, et cetera and so on, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, till now. It's all been part of an acculturation and brainwashing and counterintelligence so that people, when they're ready to hit the button, bang, would say, we'll be convinced that whatever that is an actual hostile alien invasion. That's the basis of it. Now, you've all heard that President Trump recently called for the formation of a space force. And, all right, no, wait. I'm a little long in the tooth, or getting old. I'll be 63 next week, terrifying idea. Imagine having me as a grandfather. Anyway, doing, but it's a frightening thought that, or father for that matter. But you know, the Space Force, what he's really doing is acknowledging something that already exists. All right, whether he knows that or not, I don't know. I doubt it. The people, the men and women I have dealt with for the last 25 or more years who've been in these projects have been in an operational command, Space Command and elsewhere, that have satellite systems first deployed in the 60s that could target ET craft and have been refined and refined and refined. We're on like the 200th generation, I don't know, of refinement of those technologies over the last 60 years, 50 to 60 years. But those exist already. Now, of course, what he wants to do is form a sixth branch of the acknowledged branch. And what I'm concerned about is the people who are maneuvering him to do so are people who are getting ready for this false flag threat alien invasion thing that, of course, we were warned about by Werner von Braun in the 70s and nobody listened. But I think that's an open preparation. I don't think that he's read into this. So let me explain what presidential intelligence briefings, at least to the extent I've been involved since Papa Bush in 91, 2, and Clinton onwards, is that the people who are read in heavily are people who came into the presidency or vice presidency, the case of Papa Bush or Cheney, from the committee, who had come along through their careers. But most presidents, say Bill Clinton, Bubba came in as a governor from Arkansas. He wanted to be read into this, was denied access. His CIA director was denied access. Subsequently, he was kind of told, leave this alone, and when you're an ex-president, we'll read you in, which is what happened. They didn't trust him in the Oval Office having the information, in other words. His CIA director that I briefed ended up betraying everyone, getting a position with Booz Allen Hamilton, which is the big contractor that deals with this and other things, and took sort of the golden parachute. Most people, if they're threatened enough, or if they're given enough inducements, or both, usually it's both, will take the buyout. In '92, the head of Army Intelligence offered me personally $2 billion with a B dollars to defect. I wouldn't do it. So it's most people are going to take the $2 billion. You know. But I think I always say what all this boils down to is integrity, and courage. And you got to have both. And the courage is a lot to ask for from a politician. Never mind integrity. But they know that, the people who are on the Majority Intelligence Committee that handles all this. There are dozens and dozens of unacknowledged special access projects that deal with this. They are sort of silos. For example, the gentleman who recently came forward, he was given baseline clearance, it's called, across 18 of them. But there, out of 6,000 people, there were only 3 people that had baseline clearance across them. So they're usually very, very compartmented, isolated. One of the things that he shared with me, which was very interesting, is the fact that there's a facility near Lawton, Oklahoma, near Fort Sill, where there's an underground base that has these, one of the spacecraft that was downed apparently in the 80s or 90s, that is being studied to figure out how it cloaks. And he has seen that facility. There's also a facility that where we downed an ET craft outside Seoul, South Korea, and they had to bore a huge facility into a mountain, and there's an ET craft there. There's a facility in Irvine, California, that looks like an office park, but you go way underground, and there's a facility where they're studying the extraterrestrial bodies. There's all kinds of facilities and operations, some of which I knew about and some I did not. And what was fascinating to me is that this man had been in the Army as a career person, retired, and then got rehired as a civilian, and then, and only then, was read into these projects, and he didn't even know what an unacknowledged special access project was. But when he saw this movie, he went, this man knows what he's talking about. So he was pulled into what's called the TMO, Technology Management Office of the Pentagon. Let's go to the next slide. And this is a couple of this is by no means comprehensive. I just wanted to give you an idea of where some of these facilities are, and kind of where they're, how they're structured. There's an entire Edwards base and related facilities on the left here, Edwards Air Force Base in the high desert of California. And you have these various, Haystack Butte is a specific place that has an underground facility underneath that, China Lakes. George Norton has been decommissioned, Tabletop Mountain, and Blackjack Control. Interesting, Blackjack Control is at Edwards. The top secret document that's the National Reconnaissance Office, which is the office that runs all the super secret spy satellites, mentions Blackjack operation, but Blackjack Control, and that's out of Nellis, so-called Area 51, although it's not really called Area 51. But Blackjack Control is actually at the Edwards facility. Now, what you need to know is that you can go into an underground connector at Edwards, and I know people who have done this in their jobs, connect to an underground tunneling system and surface at Nellis. All right? So Bing. Bechtel Corporation, I'll mention, there's a nuclear-powered tunneling device that bores through solid bedrock and glassifies it. And then they put these high-speed electromagnetic transport systems in. So people can go underneath the surface of the Earth at one point and appear at another point in the continental United States. It was sort of honeycombed with a number of these tunnels and underground facilities. One thing to keep in mind, nothing that is mission critical is on the surface of the Earth. It is either underground or in space. If it's above a nuclear blast zone, surface of the Earth, or an asteroid hit level of the surface of the Earth, it is not critical. Or if it's critical, it's got a mirror facility underground. That's what the COG is, continuity of government. You know what that is? COG? No. You know, if a nuclear weapon went off and took out the whole government in Washington, there's a continuously running system. It used to be in Mount Weather, and it's near there now. And actually on 9/11, Senator John Warner, who's on this committee of the Majority Intelligence Committee, was taken by intelligence community agents and taken into an underground connector under the Capitol and whisked out to Mount Weather on an underground system on 9/11 because he was a critical asset. I mean, the rest of the senators weren't, but a couple, but the ones who were on the committee. And then you have aerospace facilities that are at Edwards. You have the Northrop's Ant Hill Teton Ranch, McDonnell Douglas Llano plant, Lockheed Martin Hellendale plant, Phillips Lab. These are all facilities where ARVs, so-called alien reproduction vehicle, man-made flying saucers and triangles are made. You all have heard of the Nellis complex. It's called Area 51, but it's actually areas S4, S12. Pahut Mesa and Area 19 are key. Pahut Mesa is a mesa, and underneath is where the state-of-the-art research lab is studying extraterrestrial materials are located, and Groom Lake, the test range out on that Area 51 site. It's really called the Nevada Test Range. In New Mexico, you have Los Alamos National Laboratories. They have a compartmented operation that deals with this, but more importantly, a member of my team for many years who's a senior engineer at Los Alamos, and he was in the locker room, and he was hearing some men talk about the fact they had just come back out of Dulce through the underground connector. So Los Alamos has an underground connector system to the Four Corners area. Now, a lot of people have gone there, like UFO hunters, and they go, there's nothing there on the ground. Well, no, there isn't. There's no egress, there's no access, there's no regress. It's all through underground elsewhere. But it's in that area. And that's where a lot of the PLFs are made, program life forms, the so-called aliens, the ones that are running around. It's where we grow them, is out there. Which is why they were getting a lot of the raw materials from all the cattle they were mutilating in northern New Mexico. You know this story? Oh, well, we could go on for days. But anyway, so that's the Los Alamos and Dulce complexes. You have Kirkland Air Force Base, of course, has had a historic connection, but Sandia National Lab specifically has studied this issue. And the Phillips Lab facility, Manzano Mountain Weapons Storage Facility is underground, Coyote Canyon Test Site, and then, of course, White Sands is actually a separate New Mexico facility. White Sands is its own facility, quite far away from Kirkland. That was graphic was a little mistake in there. Go to the next slide, and I'll show you some more. Is this interesting to spy on all these? In Arizona, I've had some people, a couple people, a recent man just contacted us who had worked at that facility. Years ago, a gentleman who had been in the underground facility there had worked in the compartmented operation where there were 9 separate ET spacecraft that over the years had been taken there, and then they had an underground morgue for all the ET bodies, all the ETs that we had, of course, killed, and were in storage there. So that Fort Huachuca is actually also an NSA facility in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. It's near Tombstone, ironically. All these dead ETs and craft there. It's also Army Intelligence Headquarters. It's at Fort Huachuca, way out in the desert. And there are others, of course, out in this Cheyenne Mountain, the Colorado Deep Space Network. here in Colorado has a significant research. And there's an Air Force base connected underground out further east. I'm blocking on the name. Yeah, Schroeder. That is very connected to this program. You have the Lawrence Livermore Labs in California, Pine Gap facility in Australia. They're both Magic and Australian, but it's really run by U.S. I was at a briefing with 120 world leaders on an island in the Great Barrier Reef about 5 years ago, and this Minister of Defense for Australia was there, and he was very curious because the mistake people make is that, oh, he's the Minister of Defense of Australia, he'd know everything going on in his backyard. And no, he doesn't, because these are unacknowledged special access projects that he was not read into. So it was a very interesting series of conversations. And by the way, it's very disturbing. I mean, if you're the Minister of Defense or the President or Prime Minister or CIA Director, and you find out that there's this enormous and most important technological and strategic activity in the history of the human race going on that you're not read into, you're pissed off, but you're scared. It's frightening, and it is frightening. Now, the Redstone Arsenal, there's a facility there in Alabama associated with the transdimensional research. I've been in one of the labs there, a SCIF, a Secure Communication Information Facility, SCIF. And there are amazing technologies that are being developed there, as well as associated with the Marshall Space Flight Center. The gentleman who's recently surfaced from the Technology Management Office in the sub-basement of the Pentagon said that he went down the Marshall Space Flight Center in this area and was read into the state-of-the-art killer satellite systems that had been put into space that could, and he used the word, obliterate anything in space. And it's very worrisome. Of course, it violates all kinds of treaties, but these are illegal, unacknowledged special access projects. They don't care what the law is. And then you have the Utah complex, not far from Salt Lake City. It's accessible only by air. Dugway Proving Grounds outside Provo has also classified airspace. And underneath Dugway is, I think, probably the most state-of-the-art facility, more so than so-called Area 51 or Edwards, which are older facilities. It also happens to be where the new NSA data center was built. You see this big gleaming multi-hundred-million-dollar building above ground, but there's a lot beneath ground. And of course, here you get, just a list of the alphabet soup of agencies involved. Air Force, CIA, DARPA, Defense Intelligence. DARPA is Defense Advanced Research Project Administration, FBI. All branches of the military have various divisions dealing with this. Probably the crown jewel is ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence and Navy. Earth is 2/3 covered with water, yeah? And we have a lot of assets that are underwater and that are doing things under the oceans connected to ET, and also our own underwater UFOs that are man-made that zip around. NASA has a very compartmented division that deals with this, and the National Reconnaissance Office I mentioned before, they are tasked with all the top secret satellites, but the compartment that deals with this issue would also have the killer satellites and ones with the neutrino light detectors and the weapon systems on them. Of course, the National Security Agency has some compartmented operations dealing with this, and the various space commands, which have now, of course, Trump's calling for the Space Force. The Technology Management Office in the sub-basement of the Pentagon's been around for a long time. It's way deep underneath the Pentagon. It's an unacknowledged area. There's a facility here in Irvine near I-5 and Forest Lakes Boulevard. It looks like an office park, and that's where there's a big underground research facility for the ET bodies. And I mentioned this underground base near Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where there's an ET craft being studied for its cloaking or materialization, dematerialization abilities. And then I mentioned before Seoul, South Korea. The Research Triangle Park in North Carolina has an Army Science Research Center there, Dr. Rayburn Scott and others. What's interesting about that is that, you know, people don't realize that the Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, is the highest number of PhDs anywhere in the world. And there are a lot of classified facilities in that area, in my home state. And I mentioned the NRO neutrino lights, and there are many others. So one of the things that I try to, as I go through all of that, and you get your minds around it, is to understand that it's decentralized, it's compartmented, but it's also very scattered into different fiefdoms. So you have a naval fiefdom, and you have an Air Force fiefdom, you have a CIA, and they don't always get along at all right? And then you have, let's go to the next slide, the corporate fiefdoms, sort of feudal warlords. And this is where you get into, of course, a whole lot of companies that you've heard of, some you may not have. BAE Systems, this is British, but they are very involved. BDM Corporation, Bechtel does a lot of the underground base and contracting for these facilities, construction. I actually have met Stephen Bechtel years ago. Booz Allen Hamilton, that's who the contractor was that Snowden worked for, that, you know, and then CIA Director Woolsey that I had briefed ended up becoming counsel for, but they are very involved in the ET research area. Boeing has a compartmented operation. EG&G, which has a plant on the edge of the Nellis Range. They do a lot of in fact, the early anti-gravity craft that we built that were man-made were EG&G. This one. E-Systems, which is now part of Raytheon. The brothers, I knew the executives at E-Systems, and they were telling me about the kind of technologies they had that had to do with these electromagnetic weapon systems and mental interface and all kinds of transdimensional systems. And the two brothers that had founded E-Systems were not getting along, and so rather than let that split apart and have the box open up to the public, Raytheon bought them. Lockheed Martin, they have various facilities, including in the Denver Research Center here, has a component that deals with the extraterrestrial research. It's compartmented. McDonnell Douglas has become part of Boeing. MITRE Corporation, North American Rockwell, Northrop, Phillips Lab, Raytheon, TRW, and many others. All these corporations have a piece of the pie, and they get, for example, I know a man who was an auditor for the U.S. government looking into Northrop Grumman's books, and there was a huge amount of unaccounted for spending. And he was told, this is a need-to-know basis. You don't have a need-to-know, so he basically just rubber-stamped the accounting. So what happens is that the money is run a little bit like a mafia. Now, not on this list, and it could be another list, are affiliated criminal enterprises. Okay, call them ACEs. They're just affiliated criminal enterprises. And these ACEs are ones that deal with the movement of drugs around the world, weapons, arms merchants, things of this sort, so weapons of mass destruction, things like this. That's real. It's not a conspiracy theory. The day before I was going to brief the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I was asked to go to a meeting in Crystal City, right near the Pentagon, with a former member of Congress who was one of George Bush Sr.'s consigliares. I mean, one of his real advisors, but a man who also had, and I should have had on this list, SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation. So he was an executive with SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation. And he told me, he said, "Do you realize how dangerous this group is?" I said, "Yeah, I'm quite aware of it." And he said, "Well, there's an army, this was back in 97, 21 years ago. There's an army of about 8,000 men that do nothing but move contraband and drugs around the world in classified airspace and classified aircraft. And we have already killed 2,000 of them, 1/4 of them, for minor suspected security breaches. He says, and this is why, and this guy had just retired and gone to France, this SAIC executive. But it creates an enormous cash flow because the global drug trade sort of rivals the oil trade, but except it's not on the books. So you have black money from the US government that goes into these projects from every, not just the military intelligence, Homeland Security, CIA, but also from HUD, as Catherine Austin-Fitts and others have described. But you also then have these ACEs, these affiliated criminal enterprises that are tied into these unacknowledged special access projects that create not only operational nexus with gangs and what have you, but also an enormous amount of revenue and income. Extremely dangerous. So he asked me, he said, aren't you concerned? I said, well, yes, I know about this already, and I know an investigator who had uncovered there in California. There was a Marine officer who had spotted at like 3 or 4 in the morning one of these covert flights coming into a base, and unfortunately saw that they were unloading large amounts of drugs, and he reported it and ended up being killed, made to look like a suicide. But I said, this was, I know this goes on and has been going on for decades, but it creates an enormous amount of untraceable black money, black budget money. So those are even more shadowy than these outfits. And unfortunately, the public is, one of the reasons, in my opinion, as a public health concerned medical doctor, that drugs are illegal is that they want to maintain the monopoly from these criminal enterprises. Because every study has shown that criminalizing drugs of any kind is actually counterproductive, but of course it makes it very expensive and very exclusive for a certain criminal element, which would redound to the benefit of the darker end of this operation. So this is sort of a quick 2-hour trip through the classified world, the facilities. There's certainly much more information. The key takeaway here is the technologies that sound like, would look like magic that could deceive you and the public have been developed since the 40s and 50s. And so there's in the back of your mind, as things begin to unfold over the next months to a few years, keep that in mind at all times. Keep it in mind at all times. On the other hand, there are extraterrestrial civilizations that are observing this, but we have created a very big problem. And I don't often talk about this, but this is something that certainly those of you doing the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative, which is our ambassador team that goes out and makes peaceful contact with these civilizations, needs to know this, is that these civilizations do want to interface with us, but they're likely to interface with us most in these other dimensions, because when they come into 3D, they are tracked, targeted, and hit. Now, we have had one almost disaster at Mount Shasta a few years ago, and we had a luminous light ship that was emerging up from the volcano towards us, and we all got up and were communicating with it, and suddenly we, from a very high altitude airborne craft, there was a burst of energy. Just before that, the ET craft dematerialized, but this energy crashed into the woods about 200 yards in front of us, ripping down all the trees, limbs, and you could hear it, and then it went into the earth, 15 seconds, shaking the earth. I was expecting to see a mushroom cloud. Nothing. It was a directional, scalar electromagnetic weapon. But so one of the things that has become a problem is that we're doing this as people wanting to move the planet forward into an era of universal peace and enlightenment, but within the context of all this rubbish. So let's call it the theater of operation. Earth is an armed camp. And so we have to do it with that in our mind. It doesn't stop us. And it most certainly doesn't stop these very advanced ET civilizations from interacting with us, because they can come in a trans-dimensional form and then materialize briefly and then dematerialize and then communicate with us for hours while we're sitting out in the desert. Happens all the time. Every single week we go out anywhere. Amazing, but it ain't what you think. It's very advanced consciousness and also physics going on. And we'll have electromagnetic devices out there that we start, and we have cameras. You may have seen from the webinar last month that we did in Arizona of this ET being that appeared in our circle in Arizona about this time last year, and we have a great photograph of it. And all that was seen with the naked eye was a burst of sort of a red sphere, but a camera was open, the lens was open, and here is this ET, sort of triangular shaped head, large, sort of a tunic on the chest, and appeared next to this man, an older gentleman who had had a permanent hearing loss for many years, and he continued to have contact with that ET all throughout the night. And the next morning he came crying into the session and said, "My hearing is totally normal." And it is still. So we have amazing experiences with these ETs that are actually very compassionate and very enlightened and really incredible civilizations. They get a bad rap because of what I call alienism, which is that slide where I showed all the things that are thought of as alien that are being man-made or not ET or other dimensions. But I tell people, if you enter into this state of consciousness, a deep meditative state, and connect to the great consciousness, the cosmic mind, there is such protection there, and there's such clarity there. And if your intent and your heart is, I hate to use the word pure, but if you have a clear and pure intent of why you're there, these civilizations will contact you. They're not interested in people who just are curious, and they're not interested in people who are wanting to get their technologies or shoot them down, and they're not interested in racists. Now, what do I mean by that? What has happened is the human roots of racism are very well known. It goes all the way back to the part of us that are monkeys, that organize into warring troops because one's a little different from the other. So this tribalism that has infected the human situation is sort of the original sin of humanity, where one group kills another and organizes against one another in what's called warfare, for one silly reason or another, religious, ethnic, racial, blah, 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 blah. This is now being deliberately exploited by the intelligence community through their technologies into what I call alienism, the new racism. This is not politically correct, well, I don't know, in some circles now, you never know, to be overtly racist or to be overtly homophobic or overtly misogynist or overtly anti-Semitic or whatever it is. But it is okay to be overtly alienism racist. And so the interplanetary racism is what they're developing to replace the planetary racism and tribalism. And that's being done very, very well, very carefully, through the UFO community, through the New Age community, through the media, through books, through movies, through what have you, and through their stagecraft. So we have to sort of step back, take a look at this and go, I wonder what's really going on here, and not get fooled again. With that, I want to emphasize, I am not saying that all civilizations from other star systems are happy with us. I would say they are quite unhappy. Not with the Earth and humanity per se, but with the direction the planet is going in. That's a big distinction. Because when we first started detonating atomic weapons and then developing these other classified, faster than the speed of light weapons and deploying them into space, this became an existential threat to them. To them. There are planetary systems out there that are interplanetary in their capabilities that don't even have a concept in their bioevolutionary track of war or murder. It's just not there, like we do from monkeys. So we have to understand that if you were to look through ET's eyes and step out into space and look at the last 150 years or 100 years of this planet, where we've gone from, muskets and what have you to thermonuclear weapons and other weapons, and now these USAPs that have these amazingly advanced but potentially interstellar reaching weapon systems, you could understand why they'd be less than amused. Now, this is not to say, don't conflate this as a simplistic statement. It means that there are civilizations out there that are providing a check and a balance. And also, they have a plan, another whole plan that's called Plan B. And that is in the event that we cannot get this planet under control and moving on to a level 1 civilization, as Michikaku calls, a peaceful civilization that's not destroying its biosphere, that could be universally at peace on Earth and peace in space, then, and things fall apart here, then there would be the mission to planet Earth to help put it back together. So that's an active program, because it isn't known yet how this is going to play out. It's up to you and me, all of us on planet Earth. They're not going to do it for us. No way. This is in the hands of we, the people. Don't look to the president or the government or the UN. Look to yourselves and your communities of what you can do to create universal peace, make contact with these civilizations, educate each other, and do not a breakaway civilization, but an advanced new civilization that can emerge out of the nonsense of the current culture. That's what we have to see and create. All right? Thank you very much. Let's take about a... Okay, so I wanted to open this up now for questions, and there are a number of that have come in. And, or did you check them over there? Yes. Okay. So I'll just look at these, and because there's not a mic in the audience, and we want the people on the webinar and everyone to hear it. So one question is that, are there benevolent and forward-thinking allied governments or research organizations? Yes, there are a number that are working to resolve this problem. Here's the issue, is that the center of gravity is mainly U.S., but the way these programs are structured is that they're transnational. Now, notice I'm using the word transnational rather than international. International would connote something like through the UN, conventional government to conventional government. The management of these operations is that there are satellite programs that are embedded within other countries all over the world. And those are operating under primarily U.S., but not exclusive U.S. Control. Mainly because this is the center of gravity economically, but more importantly technologically, and also military spending. And if you took the top 10 countries in the world besides the U.S., added up their entire defense budgets, it would be less than the U.S. expenditure. So that's one of the big problems, is that the amount of resources that can be siphoned off as sort of a contingency, 10 or 20% contingency, out of U.S. Defense and intelligence and related spending is so large that by itself, our black budget eclipses the next largest country in the world's entire budget. Now, this means that it's very difficult. You know, some years ago, the Ministry of Defense of France was working with us on a CE5 initiative. You all know about the French connection. And we did an expedition to France. The cover story was a training for a group of 60 people out on this estate
in Normandy. One of the senior Minister of Defense officials, Admiral Moran, was there with his assistant, and they had satellite systems and tracking systems set up. And we did the CE5, and they were I have a beautiful document from the French government committing to a long-term, forward-looking effort to make peaceful contact with these civilizations. And it's officially signed. I released that a couple years ago. Those of you who haven't seen it, you should go to our website, SiriusDisclosure.com, SIRIUS disclosure.com, and you have to navigate around, but it's up there. And there are a lot of countries. The problem is that the well-intending people in a few countries, even if they're fairly important G7 countries, have a very difficult time taking on this cabal of operations. Moreover, there are people inside those governments who will sabotage their efforts, and this is a big problem. So it needs to get corrected. It really needs some courageous leadership. Last month, I read at the end of that webinar, you may have seen, a draft address for a world leader to make, addressing the public on this issue. I don't know if you all saw it. I'm going to release it soon. I was asked to write that for a point of contact I have to President Trump and a point of contact I have to President Putin of Russia. And there are people concerned at those levels, but they're really not in control. And I think that support, yes, moral support, certainly, tangible change coming from a governmental entity, I haven't seen it in 20-some years. So I do see that the public is awakening. I mean, it's a good thing that 100,000 people a day are seeing Unacknowledged. We're going to come out, the next big educational documentary we're going to do is going to be on close encounters of the fifth kind and higher states of consciousness. And there's something else that I can't talk about that's going to be a major, even larger event. So one of the things that we're trying to do is bypass government. Because, and it's not that I don't think government's important, I just think that it's extraordinarily dysfunctional and broken. And I think it's more likely that the people awakening to this and knowing what the truth is and then taking affirmative, positive steps, such as forming their own interplanetary contact teams through the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative, using those protocols, which, people who have just downloaded the app, called the ET Contact tool that we have, you can link to it from our website, on the iTunes store or wherever, have found that they can use those protocols and the remote viewing training that's in that app, go out and they have amazing contact experiences, having never been on one of these week-long expeditions with us. So I think that everyone can empower themselves to do that. As far as governments, what I do now when I have meetings with people in the government and the mainstream is sort of a service, because I feel they have a need to know and they should know. My expectations, however, are rather low that they're going to take the issue on, because they have to bite some very big hands. They have to bite the hands of the most powerful intelligence and military operations in the world that have lethal force. They have to bite the hands of the oil, gas, coal, nuclear power, public utility, macroeconomic, petrodollar, gangbankster system, which they're all nursing on. They're all sort of feeding off that system. Because when you come out with these technologies for peaceful use, you will terminate very quickly hundreds of trillions of dollars in assets. You'll have a new civilization. You'll end poverty. You'll end pollution. You'll have a new world. And if it's used peacefully, you'll have a world that is capable of interplanetary exploration peacefully. However, the stakeholders that are out there, and were out there 100 years ago with the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers and what have you, they're still out there. But they're, X generations later, but actually more powerful. The centralization of money and power isn't in the governments. It's in the private banking and corporate sector. To give you an idea, the derivatives involved with the trading of commodities alone on the Chicago Board of Trade and Futures is around $700 or $800 trillion a year. The U.S. federal budget's what, 4 or 5 trillion. Go do the math. Okay, so it's a complicated problem. And I have never met a world leader or a minister of defense or head of an intelligence directorate or MI6 or minister of defense overseas or in this country who wants to try to take that on. Never mind a senator or a congressman. So I think that kind of leadership and courage and integrity has to come from you guys and from us. You know, I think and it's not at all to dismiss government. It's just to say if they want to make themselves irrelevant, and they have, then they'll be irrelevant to the future. If they want to make themselves relevant, they can jump on board at any time. And someone had asked the question about Trump's Space Force. I think we talked about that a moment ago. How many ARVs have been created and so far in total on the face of the Earth or underground, and how many of those are privately or corporately owned, and how many are government owned? That's a good question. They number in the thousands. It's not just a few. They've gone through multiple generations of these man-made UFOs from the 50s to now. Pretty much every form and shape that an ET craft has taken, they've tried to replicate. Now, here's an important distinction. When you're up close and see one of these that are man-made, you're going to notice there are seams, rivets, sections, parts. The ET craft do not have those. They're seamless. And just a quick example of ET manufacturing. When we manufacture something, we dig something up out of the ground and then smelt the iron ore, the aluminum or whatever, and then make sheets of metal and rivet them together, blah, 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 right? No, that's not how an interstellar civilization manufactures. Which is why all these things about, oh, they have to come to the Earth, there's such things here they have to have. I'm going, oh yeah, right. You know nothing about transdimensional interstellar physics. So you're able to set up a standing wave, a resonant field, that is in the near astral, like a blueprint, like an architectural blueprint, and resonate it and materialize it, bring it into this dimension, all in a part. That's why they're seamless. And this is one of the comical stories I like to tell is this captain of a naval contract vessel that was retrieving ICBMs that were being fired downrange in the South Atlantic contacted me years ago because they had one of these ET craft on radar at night, and they were able to triangulate it, and apparently their command center hit it with one of these electromagnetic weapons in, I believe, 1963. And the captain of this research vessel that ended up retrieving it the next day went in, he contacted me mainly to give me the information, but also he had another one of these questions that he couldn't understand. And the ET was in a metallicized sort of uniform, and it was all one piece. And it didn't have any zippers or buttons or anything. And he was this old, crusty Navy guy. He says, what I don't understand, how in the world could he have gotten in and out of that? There's no way to get in it, no way to get out of it. He would have had to live in it all his life. I said, no. They set up an electromagnetic field, and it actually form-fits, materializes around him, all in one piece, in a fraction of a second. And the uniform is in of itself also integrated into his bioelectric field and communication systems. So it's not just clothing, made in a slave factory in Bangladesh, bought by Banana Republic or whatever, sorry. But, I think what you have to understand is that you're dealing with civilizations whose technologies are not what we're trying to anthropocentrically project on them. So there are thousands of, and they're not just in the US, they're in underground bases, underwater bases, Australia, UK, around the world, that are man-made. But they're not used all that much, but they've gone through a number of series of developments, but they're not at the level of refinement of a trans-dimensional interstellar spacecraft in terms of how they look, how they operate, how they feel. And it's an important thing for you to know, because if you're out doing, a CE5 contact, is it real or is it Memorex? Like the old commercial used to say, is it an ET craft or is it one of ours? Sometimes you don't know until you get a closer or more intimate event happen, like the ET resonantly forms in the circle with you or begins to speak. Actually, one of the ones that we photographed at Joshua Tree was actually speaking right outside the circle. There were 4 or 5 of them, but they were non-corporeal. You couldn't see any bodies, but you could hear them speaking. Everyone did, and we got quiet. And a friend of mine, Raven, took a photograph, and here's this ET, who I named Bijou. He told me his name was Bijou, from Andromeda, 2.5 million light years from here. Beautiful experience. And that then continued on the rest of the night with all manner of incredible intimate contact. So the man-made machines are going to look and feel like a machine. They're going to be invasive, and they're going to have structural parts. You can tell that they were manufactured together. But there are quite a few of them. I don't know if that clarified or not. I'm trying to use each question to go and share stuff that I think is important. There's a question here if I think that all or some abduction experiences are instigated by the military or the alphabet agencies. Yeah, let me be really clear about this. There are people who've had contact with ETs, and they may have been frightened or startled by it. And there are people who have been abducted by things that look alien that absolutely are being done by the intelligence community. And there's an area of overlap where people don't know what's going on because the stagecraft, the ability to hoax one versus the other is so good. Interestingly, when Stan Romanek, when we were at his house and he played this tape of someone who had called and left a message for him. Ricky was there, and there was someone who was trying to give him a heads up, and they were using a synthesized British-sounding voice. And this event that had happened, I think it was the next day or very recently after that, this person called using this computer-generated voice saying, Stan, it was one of the fake ones. Well, he didn't know what a fake one meant. I said, well, it's a man-made one. So there are people who have had actual contact with ETs and have actual on-board experiences. That's how I got involved with this, from an event that happened with me when I was 18. And then there are people who have had very invasive events happen from the intelligence community and paramilitary operations that look 100% alien but aren't. And then sometimes you don't know which was which. So I'm not saying people haven't had contact at all. I'm just saying that you have to have this in your differential diagnosis, as we say in medicine. And one of my concerns is, I was contacted years ago by the head of something called the Intruders Foundation that Bud Hopkins had. And the executive director called me up and he says, Dr. Greer, you don't know how right you are. We have a lot of people in our group that have said they've been abducted. And in their memories, they see that the things that look like aliens are actually being commanded and directed by military personnel. But that's all being sanitized out of the reports to the public. On the other hand, people have had actual contact with ETs where it was a positive experience or a healing experience or an enlightenment. Those we leave out totally. And there is this sampling skew, selective data cherry picking of stuff that has gone on in the abduction and UFO research community for 40 years or more. That's worrisome, because what that means is the public is only being presented with the stage-crafted disinformation part of the picture, and the rest gets taken out. I didn't believe it when I first heard it, and it turned out it was 100% true. So this is where I become very questioning of, when someone has an experience, I have to drill down on what part of it might have been actual ET, or was it something being done by these advanced systems, electromagnetic, mental, physical, transdimensional that the intelligence community has, because I know they have them and I know they've deployed them many, 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 many times, probably thousands of times. The question always is, if you can't tell the difference, then what do you make of it? Well, then you just say, well, we don't know. You have to be agnostic. I mean, sometimes you don't know what the initiating source of the experience was. But you have to keep an open mind and try to get more data, more information, and try to get to the truth. I mean, after all, this is, science and also exploration. It's about finding the truth, wherever it leads you. Now, this particular truth has made me quite hated in the UFO subculture as sort of an apologist for the evil aliens. I'm going, well, I'm just trying to explain what's actually going on. All right. There's a question about, is there any insight on the release of new technologies and what the insiders are saying? I think that there are some people, as I mentioned, there's an initiative out of Salt Lake City that's a private corporation, Equity Research, that has a anti-grav. What's interesting to me is that is being, it's been intercepted by the intelligence community, who at this time are pretending to be friendly to it to support its disclosure as of a month or two ago. Now, what I don't know is if they're going to go through with it, and if they do, how it'll be spun. Because unfortunately, this system is not just a zero-point energy generating system. It's one that they've developed the capability of tapping into these interdimensional fields as well as life forms, and that I've been told is of interest for its psychological warfare value to disclose that as what aliens are, and as distinct from transdimensional extraterrestrial biologicals that are from other star systems. And I think the question is, will that technology be disclosed for purposes that could be good for the human future, or will it be part of a counterintelligence initiative? That's what I'm investigating right now. But I do know it's been fast-tracked and approved. The last I heard, it was for disclosure. I understand here in Colorado, and end of April, early May, they had a week-long meeting with a lot of government and other people to discuss this, and the outcome of which is unknown. So I'm not sure where that's going. I'm hoping that they do not use it in the way that I have been told they intend to, which would be in the direction of really disinforming the public about this. We're always looking for people who have on their own figured out so-called zero-point or technologies. There are some that we're pursuing now up in Canada. So far, we've never found one that passes muster, both technologically but also strategically, meaning that they're willing to have it disclosed on a massive scale on an open source, non-intellectual property basis. What I mean by that is, if you go the IP route, intellectual property route, and the patenting route, it's going to get intercepted. You're going to get a national security order on it. If you go through the conventional funding mechanism, it's also going to be a takedown. There are about 1,000 ways these technologies get ensnared. And every single inventor and investor group that I know that's stepped into this space has fallen into one or more of those traps. So we have a very specific requirement that now, if they need to be financially compensated, there are people that I'm working with who have that ability to do so very easily. And I don't want to, but it's substantial to get it clear to be an open source system. Open source meaning that it would be dumped on the internet, no secrecy, no patent, no intellectual property holdback, massively disclosed. So if someone had $100 million, $20 million could go to acquire and further develop the technology. 80 needs to go into the disclosure of it, so that every man, woman, and child with access to the internet on planet Earth, which is at least half the planet, would know about it. that has to happen, because if it's secret and it's small, it will vanish. And they always vanish. And the team will vanish as well. So we are pursuing that. Speaking personally, I try to avoid technologies that are not, if the holders of the technology, and particularly the money people, don't want to go through that strategic pathway, even if they're compensated, then I don't really want to even know about it, because they're going to all be assassinated. You know, the people who acquired Stan Meyer's material, we were trying to get it through my project, the Orion Project. A group that had more money than we had, because we only had a few $100,000, ended up acquiring it up in Michigan, an engineering group. A couple years later, I get a call from their chief funder, who is Lord so-and-so, I'm not going to say his name here, up in Great Britain. And he says, look, you know, they've gotten these things operational, including Stan Meyer's toroid. And he had a donut-shaped object that had a national security order on it. And that was the main thing we were wanting to get. And this group got it operational. And it was over Unity. It was putting out free energy. It had a kind of a liquefied, magnetically charged material in the center of this toroid. And Murder Incorporated came after them. And they were getting death threats and all kinds of problems, all kinds of WSFM, electromagnetic weapon systems. And their fantasy was that they were going to evacuate to an eco-friendly country. I said, you'd have to go to an eco-friendly planet. There is no country on this planet that these henchmen won't find you. So I wrote out a 3-page strategic thing they needed to do instantly to protect themselves and to protect the technology that included a massive data dump into the internet and a press conference and getting it out of their own hands in a secretive corporate way. They wouldn't do it, and the last I heard, they've all been assassinated. They're all dead. So I've been through from 1991 to now probably dozens of these sort of initiatives. They've all ended in absolute mind-crushing, heartbreaking disasters. I won't do it anymore. It has to be someone who understands what they're up against. And most of the engineering people think, oh, I have a better mousetrap. The world will be the path to my door. No, Murder Incorporated is going to be the path to your door first. Or they think that, you know, I'm going to outwit the intelligence community. I was talking to a guy in Orange County. He had one of these. We're going to put it into 150 different patents, and they won't know what we have. I said, they know what you have already. I've already heard from people at the agency about what you're doing. You have? I said, well, of course. They monitor everything in real time. As soon as you have a device operating that taps into that field, the zero-point field or related, that's picked up by a satellite. The same as if you set off a nuclear weapon. They know what you have, when you have it, before you have it, or contemporaneously at the same time. I said, you're delusional if you think you're going to trick anyone in the unacknowledged special access project world to have these kinds of technologies and be off the radar. There was another guy up in Canada I met with a year ago, and he said, oh, well, we're going to put it in power plants in Africa, and nobody will know we have it. I'm going, oy vey. Where's a rock? I'm going to kill myself right now. You know, it's just like so completely ridiculous because they just don't understand strategically what they're up against. And this is the Achilles heel of people who are brilliant engineers or even brilliant financiers. They think it's like coming out with a new version of an iPhone. No, it isn't. You're coming out with something that's going to terminate hundreds of trillions of dollars of oil, gas, coal, banking, petrodollar, et cetera, macroeconomic power. Not just money, power. Those folks are going to do everything within their ability to stop you. So you have a handful of petro-Nazis and gangbangsters who want this stopped, but you have 7.5 billion people who will be on your side. Give it to the people. So that's my message. There's a way to do it. It's a heavy lift, and even then it's dangerous. Now, frankly, I think that the first level of disclosure on those technologies needs to be a stationary, in other words, sit on your table here or sit out where your heat pump is. that would be an energy generating system. I think that the things that are teleportation or anti-grav and what have you that can be weaponized into a missile delivery system needs to be a second level of disclosure in terms of an applied technology, because obviously anything like that can be applied by anyone once they have the knowledge into a weapon delivery system. And that gets into this other big question of what are we going to do when we grow up as a people? You know, I mean, we're stuck in the 1800s paradigm with our energy and technology. Don't fool yourself with all your little computer gadgets. I mean, everything this planet is running on is circa 1800s, late 1800s. Oil, gas, coal, even nuclear is mid-1900s. So if we want to move on to a level 1 civilization, this has to come out, but it cannot come out if it's going to be used in a weaponized way. So we have to have an evolution of consciousness and the structures within society to have, let's call it an enforceable peace. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but where we maintain the world in a stable, peaceful state so that these technologies can be used safely to then transform the world from a place that's collapsing environmentally, but also in terms of the suffering and poverty on the planet, and can be transformed into a prosperous, abundant, stable environment, clean environment. And the earth, she is a conscious living being, and she will be able to heal herself very quickly if we stop abusing her. But we keep abusing her. And we have to lift the burden from the earth, and these sciences and technologies would do it. But it's not a step forward if we bring the technologies out and then they're applied to be put into a different and new weapon system. Now, in all honesty, that's what's already happened. Between 1940s and now, the most advanced of these technologies are in the absolute worst possible hands, many of them, and who are not being overseen by we the people or our government of we the people or by any accountable agency. And what that means is the people who are the holders and controllers of those systems, it's sort of checkmate. And this gets into a really deep problem. One of the things that happened when I was briefing the head of intelligence for the Joint Staff, Admiral Wilson, he was very upset about all of this. He had made an inquiry into these projects prior to my meeting with him, and I did what's called a stand-up briefing at the Pentagon for him. And Astronaut Edgar Mitchell was with me and a few other people I was teaching. Edgar Mitchell about these things. And when I was in this briefing, at the end, I said, we really need your help, Admiral, in disclosing this information and getting these technologies under control and into folks like you, the white hats, which is most of the people in the military intelligence community are very good people, actually. But we need your help. And he says, well, what am I going to do? I've learned that there are groups that are denying me access, because he had tried to access one of these unacknowledged compartmented projects, and they said, sir, we will not read you into this, and hung up on him. He says, but they won't let me in, and the best thing I have that I know about is the B-2 stealth, and they have things that are 100 generations further along that are anti-grav and can do circles around my B-2 stealth. It's point, set, match. He says, I've been checkmated, number one. Number two, he said, who else have you met with who is being denied access like I am? I said, well, the current director of the CIA and the president and the Secretary of Defense, Cohen, and people like that. And he said, well, what the hell am I going to do? If I don't get an order from the civilian commanders, then I'm going rogue. How do I get control of it? And they won't give me the order because they're scared shitless. That's when I realized between 93 and 97, 98, we have to do this. And we have to bring out the sciences, the technologies, the information, and also be the ambassadors of peace to these civilizations. That's what has to happen. How do we protect ourselves from the technologies that are used to harm or deceive us? And how do we develop our highest consciousness? A great question. I like answering questions like this. I know this is sort of apocryphal, but people learn through stories. Back in '94, in July '94, I was asked to meet with Prince Hans Adam von Liechtenstein, the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, who was funding all the abduction cults in the United States. Because, as he worded it to me, he'd like us to go to World War III so that Jesus Christ would return. And, no, I'm quoting. So, yeah, I kid you not. Anyway, welcome to my world. Anyway, so, doing. So, zing, but that's the way my life is. I mean, yeah. Anybody want to make a movie? So, anyway, so, we have this many-hour meeting, and, he was trying to convince me to cross over to the dark side. I hate to sound like Star Wars, and I said, I understand what's going on. But he was really trying to convince me, and he said, the reason that I fund these abduction groups is that I want people to hate the aliens so that we can make the case for Armageddon, World War III. Now these, of course, in Liechtenstein, the banking entities, of course, funded Hitler, and now there's a lot of money going into these programs. And I said, well, I don't really share that paradigm, worldview, but so we had, we agreed to disagree and what have you. But what happened that night is that I was at the St. Moritz Hotel on Central Park South, and my daughter was with one of my daughters. And I went to sleep, and there was an electromagnetic weapon system that targeted me. That said, oh yeah, you don't want to go into that area, we're going to hit you with one. So they attempted to abduct me. Now, the way a lot of these abductions are done is through what I call an astral body extraction, where they target you and then try to pull out your body, and then you'll have an experience thinking it was in your physical body, and you actually will have physical stigmata when you get back in it, because the astral body and the body of light actually manifest this one. This is what you've got to understand. Primacy is with consciousness and these subtle trans-dimensional, interdimensional realms that then manifest the 3D, not the other way around. So I knew this was happening. It was actually really terrifying. And I was like, oh. So what I did, I went in and I meditated, and I went into deep meditation and called on the power of God, as I understand this supreme great being, and I transcended into sort of this beautiful cosmic consciousness state, and it stopped because the drop of my individuality became the ocean. And they can't grab the ocean. They can only grab the drop. Got it? So I said, this is the spirit warrior stuff I was talking about. That's the next workshop. It's going to be a whole afternoon of that. So I think what people have to understand is, yes, these systems are frightening and they are effective, but only if you don't understand the God-given gifts you have folded within you. And I love the quote that says, thinkest thyself a puny form when within thee the universe is folded. It's a rhetorical question. In other words, you're not just a little thing. You have the entirety of the cosmos and creation folded as a quantum conscious hologram in every single person. So as you go into higher states of consciousness and meditative practice, you begin to realize that that can be used in very practical ways, and that's how I kind of cut off that abduction attempt. Does that make sense? Does that help? Yeah.
Does that mean that you've got to be able to enter into an astral state?
No, you transcend beyond the astral, because they're operating on astral. So a quick trip through the cosmology. You have your physical body, you have your body of light, you have the essence, the thought form that is your individuality. Folded within all of that is, and permeating it, is the consciousness field. The consciousness field is non-local, infinite power, eternal, boundless. When you connect into that aspect of consciousness and quiet mind, you've transcended. The drop is now the ocean, and the power of the ocean is in your support. You're not isolating yourself in ego. So you have to go beyond even individuation or individuality. But that's the transcendent experience of the meditative state.
What did it feel like instantaneously when you first recognized that this was going to happen to you?
Well, you know, at first it just seems like you were awake, but you weren't aware of anything. It was just aware of awareness, pure consciousness. It's simple. It's very beautiful. When I died, and when I was 17, you may know this story, I was raised a devout atheist, and I had this experience where I died because I was very sick, and it's a long story. I don't have time for it. But I had this experience of unity consciousness where the unboundedness of the cosmos and I were a singularity. And it was beautiful. But that caused me to search how to do it here. So I learned meditation. And the first time I meditated, bang, transcended. So I went to samadhi. So what that was that I had the pathway was open. Even though I was like this 17-year-old kid that was raised an atheist and in enormous poverty, and I was all that. But I realized, oh, well, everyone can do this. Now, my meditation teacher looked at me at the end of the 20-minute meditation and said, well, you transcended. And of course, I was so naive. I said, oh, isn't that what we were supposed to do? I didn't understand you were supposed to make a geshrai about this and flagellate yourself for 50 years on a bed of nails in order to go into this state. But actually, it's incredibly simple. It's extraordinarily simple. You just let go of yourself. And in this case, I was using a mantra, and then just let go. And then I became aware of awareness and just only into that ocean of unbounded mind. So I got to where I could do this at will very easily. And that's what I train people now to do. Because when you're in that state, you're not really that vulnerable.
But at 17, you were thrown into it.
Yeah, I don't know, for whatever reason. I mean, well, I was a stupid jock who had an injury on my left thigh and bicycled 200 miles, and it spread this huge infection. And then I had hepatorenal syndrome and kidney failure, and I was so poor. I was in high school supporting myself in my own apartment, and I died. Because I couldn't go to a doctor. I was too poor to see a doctor, because we don't have health care in this country. Speaking as a public emergency doctor. Anyway, but luckily, I survived. Well, no, I didn't want to come back. I was asked to. But that's a long story. Long story. That's one of the things that you have to kind of understand is that all these technologies, it's like a gnat flying in front of the sun. If you understand the sun is inside of each of you. So don't give it, that's what I said a while back, don't give this more power than it deserves. It doesn't deserve that much power. It is, in a sense, electromagnetic witchcraft and dark magic and dark use of energies. But the light is always a millionfold, infinitely greater than the dark. And if you stay connected to that, don't worry about it. It doesn't mean it won't be difficult. And there are experiences I've had that are very scary. And I've had a few near-death experiences. And you know the story back in the 90s where 3 people on my team, through these little warfare systems, got cancer the same month. I was one of them. Yeah, they can do some nasty stuff. But I survived. Unfortunately, 2 didn't. And then the Wetworks teams, when we were going to get one of these technology systems from Bill Colby, the CIA director, they killed him, made it look like an accidental drowning. But the week we were going to meet with him, with a member of my board, they found him floating down the Potomac River. And that's when, for years, I'd had people come to me and say, do you want protection? From the intelligence community who are on our side of this, the white hats. And I would say, no, I don't want to get involved in that spy versus spy stuff. Then I said, yes. So that's in place. So, someone crosses me at their great peril. And I won't even know about it.
When you were targeted through the weapons system, did you feel yourself about to pass out and see everything get fuzzy and feel, because I've also asked for protect, did you feel yourself physically come out of your body? Because I've also had a similar experience, and to protect myself, I also did similar to what you have done, but it was way before I even was aware of who you were.
Yes, well, there are people who have natural out-of-body experiences that frighten them just because it's something unusual. And I'm talking about a specific electronic warfare system inducing it. In this case, I knew. I mean, it was a directional. I mean, I could even tell what direction from out of the window this was coming at me from. And I'm highly intuitive, sort of like a dog. You know, if you can look at a dog, will have its back to you, and see if you look at it, it'll feel and turn. I'm like that. You know, sort of like a big dog. But I love animal dogs, by the way. That's a compliment. So it's something you definitely can do. And I think one of the important things to learn from these technologies is that they're all based, from what I said earlier, think about the Vedic cities, Siddhis. Every single one of those capabilities are folded within you innately. And when you need them, and you practice consciousness development, they will be there for you. Now, they may not be there all the time, but I have had a couple of levitation experiences just because I didn't need it. It was just in a state and it spontaneously happened and I floated. So any of these experiences can come to you spontaneously as you practice meditation, experience higher states of consciousness, and learn the structure of the cosmos. And as you go into that journey, and it's not religious development, but it's spiritual development, which I make a distinction between the two, since they're usually 180 degrees opposite. Not always, but frequently. So religiosity and spirituality are usually 180 degrees opposites. The doctrine overruns the spiritual part. But at any rate, if you practice these, and from whatever tradition works for you, for me, it was the meditative state and the ancient Vedic knowledge in the cities. But then I began to realize that those were all not only mirrored in the extraterrestrial phenomenon of teleportation, bilocation, solid objects like here at Blanca Peak, a massive ET craft in broad daylight went straight into that mountain and didn't hit it because it was just slightly able to resonantly shift its field so solid matter can go straight through solid matter. Because you realize, most of this, quote, matter that makes up your body, if you took the space out of it, would fit on the tip of a needle, a tip of a pin. That's how much matter you are. The rest is this other energy field. So if you just took the matter and moved it a little bit out of spin or angular momentum with other solid systems, you could pass right through it, which is what a Vedic master does when he walks through a wall, right? Or an ET craft when it's shifted and goes straight into the earth or into the water and doesn't explode, because it's not, no atom of the one is touching the other. Does this make sense? So, but think about that. You have that ability built within you, within your hardware and your software of a human or of an ET. So all these technologies you can demystify them by understanding yourself and understanding your own spiritual capabilities and what the capabilities are in humanity. And the beauty of that is that then it's not so alien. It's actually very natural. But there is a sort of an educational discovery process to that has to do with understanding what the human potential is, which is enormous, beautiful.
Can higher civilizations protect us from, like, our sun, like a massive coronal mass ejection?
There was a question about any of these civilizations can protect us if they wish from anything. Here's the big problem, and I'm glad you asked this question. The reason I met with the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency in late 90s, early 2000s, was to read him into these projects that he was being denied access to and give him a warning that our systems on Earth and in space had become so developed that they had become an existential threat to ET operations, and that the ETs for millions of years, and one or few civilizations for upwards of 1 billion years, have been guardians protecting life on Earth. But when we force them too far out of this dimension, then there are things out in space that could be very harmful to us, that could hit us. And it isn't to say that they couldn't then re-emerge but at their own great peril. So we are putting the planet at risk for things that it has traditionally been protected from that we have very little knowledge of, because we have weaponized these satellite systems in space and also ground-based systems that can reach. So what that means is these technologies in the wrong hands are, it's like, forgive them, they know not what they do. They don't even understand, some of these folks, how reckless and foolish the toys. It's sort of a Strangelovian level. Dr. Strangelove, my reference there. Strangelovian level of madness, like the mad scientists and mad people who are in their own little covert bubble. But there are consequences to doing this. And this is why I wanted to wrap up with a few simple points. The solutions are the disclosure and ethical oversight of these USAP technologies. Now that's a big one, is what we were just talking about. We have to reach a point where these systems and the technologies have an ethical and conscious and enlightened oversight. Without that, it is very dangerous. And that is why the Disclosure Project, why I founded it back in the 90s. Higher states of consciousness. By understanding and entering into these states of consciousness, not only can you know what they're doing, but you can protect yourself and the planet. Because people who come together in prayerful and meditative states have a morphogenic field effect that's enormously protective, beyond what you can imagine, even in the physical domain. This is why they've done studies with intercessionary prayer studies, where they found people praying with a pure heart for someone who's 1,000 miles away. It has a very amazing effect. And so if people act together in a conscious and enlightened way, it really can put us off the course of destruction onto a path of enlightenment and universal peace. And this is why the next big program we're going to roll out is a global mass awareness of close encounters of the fifth kind. If you understand, I think one time it was called the Maharishi effect, because they'd send meditators into a city and they'd meditate and the crime rates would go down. It only took 1%. So if Denver has 2 million people, then you would need 20,000 people to go there. But what they found is that, and this is also true in physics, is that if you look at, in quantum physics, superfluidity and helium, it only takes about 1% of the molecules becoming coherent in that substrate, in the helium, as it approaches absolute zero. And when 1% is reached, the entire container takes on these magical properties that are, where all of them at once go bang, superfluid and coherent. They all align. So don't think that you have to get 99% of the public or 50.1. This is not an election. You need 1% who understand where we are, what the risks are, what the solutions are in consciousness and meditation, peaceful contact, and even these technological solutions moving together. Now, on Earth, that would be about 75 million people. We hope with this next documentary and educational program, we can reach about 100 million people to enter into meditative states together and contact states together, to show these civilizations another face to humanity, an enlightened, peaceful face that can then put us on the path of where we're supposed to have been 100 years ago, and that is universal peace, the ending of poverty, the stabilization of the environment with these wondrous new sciences and technologies that would heal the earth, and go forward as an interstellar people peacefully. That's where we're headed, and it is going to take a certain quantum number, but it isn't 99%. It's like 1%. So that's what our next project is, and I hope you will all help us with that endeavor. Thank you very much. I appreciate you.